She had 48 hours of nursing experience and a secret she'd spent 3 years burying. The man on the gurney was dying, not from the crash, not from the blood, but from something threading through his bloodstream that nobody in that emergency room recognized. Nobody except Emily Carter, who recognized it because she'd seen it in a forward operating base outside a city most of these doctors couldn't find on a map. She broke protocol. She broke orders. She broke the career she'd barely started, and when security dragged her toward the exit, the man's heart stopped. That was the moment everything changed. Before we go any further, if you've never been here before, hit that subscribe button right now, because this channel is where ordinary people turn out to be anything but ordinary. Hit the like button if you want more stories like this one, and drop a comment telling me what city and country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because what happens next in that emergency room is something nobody in Harlow County General Hospital will ever forget. The morning Emily Carter reported for her second shift at Harlow County General Hospital, she burned her toast, missed her bus, and arrived 7 minutes late with a coffee stain on her left sleeve. None of that was unusual. What was unusual was that she'd slept 4 hours the night before. Not from anxiety about the job, not from city noise, but because somewhere around 2 in the morning she'd sat up in bed with her heart going too fast and her hands already reaching for something that wasn't there. An old reflex. A bad one. She'd pressed her palms flat against the mattress and counted backward from 100 until her breathing evened out, and then she'd stared at the ceiling until 5 a.m. when she finally gave up and made the toast she then burned. Clearwater, Colorado was supposed to be quiet. That was why she'd chosen it. Harlow County General was supposed to be a fresh start. That was why she'd applied there and nowhere else. A mid-sized regional hospital in a mid-sized mountain town where the biggest emergencies were ski accidents and altitude sickness and the occasional farm equipment injury. Where nobody would look at a 27-year-old woman with short-cropped dark hair and slightly too watchful eyes and wonder what she'd left behind. She changed into her scrubs in the locker room, clipped her badge to her chest. Carter, E/nursing staff/probationary, and walked out into the controlled chaos of the morning shift. The ER at Harlow County General wasn't glamorous. The overhead lights flickered in Bay 3 and had been flickering for 6 weeks. The supply cart nearest the nurses' station had a broken wheel that caught on the floor tile every time you pulled it left. The coffee maker in the break room produced something that smelled like coffee and tasted like a medical supply catalog. Emily had cataloged all of this in her first 48 hours because cataloging environments was something she did automatically, the way other people breathe. "You're late," said Donna Reyes without looking up from the chart she was annotating. Donna was the charge nurse on the day shift, mid-40s, efficient, the kind of woman who had seen everything twice and found most of it unremarkable. She wasn't hostile to Emily. She wasn't particularly warm either. She was simply present, which Emily had decided was good enough. 7 minutes, Emily said. I know, it won't happen again. It happened yesterday, too. That was 5 minutes. Donna looked up. There was something in her expression that might have been the beginning of amusement, or might have been warning. Room 4 needs vitals, and the patient in room 7 is asking for more pain medication. He was already asking before I got here, so assume he's been at it a while. On it. The morning moved the way hospital mornings move, fast in the wrong places and glacially slow everywhere else. Emily took vitals, updated charts, assisted with a dressing change on a construction worker with a forearm laceration that had gotten infected before he'd bothered to seek treatment, and spent 20 minutes talking a frightened 16-year-old girl through the process of having her first IV placed. The girl's mother stood in the corner holding her purse with both hands and watching Emily like she was deciding whether or not to trust her. Emily didn't rush it. She talked the girl through every step. Here's the rubber band, here's the cold swab, here's the small pressure, gone before you count to 3. The girl barely flinched. Her mother's grip on the purse loosened. Small victories. Emily had learned to count them. What she had not yet learned was how to be invisible enough. That was the problem with fresh starts. You could change your name on the paperwork, you could change your city, you could trade in the uniform that had defined you for 4 years, but your hands still moved the way they'd been trained to move. You still clocked exits without meaning to. You still listened to the quality of someone's breathing when they said they were fine. She was restocking the supply cabinet near the nurse's station when she heard Dr. Marcus Hale's voice before she saw him. "Where's my consult on the Lawson patient? I asked for it an hour ago." He was walking fast. He always walked fast. The kind of speed that was less about urgency and more about performance, about making sure everyone in the corridor knew he was the most important object in any given room. Marcus Hale was chief of surgery at Harlow County General, and he had been for 11 years. And in those 11 years, he had apparently confused tenure with infallibility. He was tall, early 50s, with silver hair he wore swept back, and a way of looking at people that sorted them automatically into useful and irrelevant. Emily had been useful exactly once in her first 2 days, when he'd needed someone to repeat an order to a patient and Donna wasn't available. Every other interaction had categorized her as irrelevant. She was fine with that. "Dr. Hale," said one of the residents, jogging slightly to keep pace, "the consult is in the system. I sent it at... Send it to me directly next time. I don't dig through the system at 7 in the morning." He glanced toward the supply cabinet, and his gaze moved across Emily, the way eyes move across furniture. "Carter?" She looked up. "Yes, sir." "You were late this morning." "I was." "It won't happen again." "See that it doesn't. Probationary staff who can't manage punctuality don't make it off probation." He didn't wait for a response. He was already moving again, trailing the resident behind him like a reluctant planet around a sun. Donna appeared at Emily's shoulder. "Don't take it personally." "I don't. He talks to everyone like that." "I know." Emily closed the supply cabinet. "I grew up around men who talked like that. You learn to hear the words and not the tone." Donna studied her for a moment. "Where'd you work before this?" It was the question Emily had been waiting for since she'd arrived. She had an answer prepared, a version of the truth that was technically accurate and strategically incomplete. "Government contract work, medical support, not clinical, more field adjacent. I decided I wanted to go back to direct patient care." It wasn't a lie. It wasn't the whole picture either. But Donna nodded like it made sense, which was the response Emily had designed it to produce, and went back to her charts. The call came in at 10:47 a.m. Emily was at the nurse's station updating a medication record when the radio traffic from the paramedics cut through the ambient noise of the ER with the specific quality of urgency that makes everyone in a room look up at the same time. "Harlow County, this is Unit 7. We're inbound with a single male, approximately 50 years, found unresponsive at the scene of a highway collision on Route 9, mile marker 44. Patient presents with altered consciousness, irregular pulse, multiple surface lacerations consistent with vehicular trauma, and a pause. The kind of pause that meant the paramedic was looking at something and trying to find the right words for it. Possible secondary event, cause undetermined. ETA 4 minutes. Copy, Unit 7. The charge coordinator picked up the phone to alert the trauma bay. Donna was already moving. "Bay 1, full trauma protocol." She looked at Emily. "You're with me." Copy. It took Emily 2.5 minutes to review what the paramedics had sent ahead. Vitals, preliminary assessment, the sparse details of the crash scene. The patient had been found in a vehicle that had drifted off Route 9 into a ditch. No other vehicles involved. No skid marks indicating evasive action. The vehicle had been identified as a government-leased fleet car registered to a federal contractor. None of that meant anything specific yet. But the combination, the single vehicle incident, the absence of skid marks, the vague note about a secondary event, lodged itself somewhere in the back of Emily's mind and stayed there. The ambulance bay doors opened at 10:51. The man on the gurney was big, 6 feet and then some, broad across the shoulders in a way that suggested a body built for physical demands rather than a gym. He was unconscious. The paramedics had him stabilized, an oxygen mask over his face, 2 IVs running. The surface injuries were what you'd expect from a vehicle that had left the road and struck an embankment. A gash across his left temple, bruising along his jaw, lacerations on both hands that suggested he'd been gripping the steering wheel when the impact happened. All of that was consistent with the crash. What Emily noticed, what she noticed in the first 5 seconds while the paramedics were still talking, and Donna was directing the bay staff and someone was calling for Dr. Hale, was not consistent with the crash. The man's lips had a faint bluish tinge at the corners. Not the cyanosis of oxygen deprivation. He was on oxygen, and his saturation reading wasn't bad enough to explain it. His skin was slightly waxy in a way that didn't match the coloring of someone who'd just experienced physical trauma. And his pupils, she leaned close, flicked her penlight, were unequal. Not dramatically, not in the way of a serious head injury, but asymmetrically responsive in a way that didn't fit the mechanism of the crash. She stepped back and looked at his hands. The lacerations from the crash were on the palms and fingers, but there was a smaller mark, almost invisible, nearly lost in the bruising near his wrist. That was something else entirely. She looked at it for 3 seconds. Then she straightened up and found Donna. "I want to flag something," she said, keeping her voice level. Donna was reading the paramedic's handoff notes. "What?" "His presentation doesn't fully match the trauma. The pupillary response is off for the crash mechanism, and there's a mark on his left wrist that—" "Carter," Dr. Hale's voice cut across the bay as he walked in pulling on gloves. "What are you doing?" "Flagging an observation, sir." "You're a probationary nurse on day 3. He was already moving to the patient's side, the efficient sequence of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. "Observations get flagged through the charge nurse, not announced in the middle of a bay. Step back." She stepped back. She didn't stop looking at the patient. Hale ran his assessment quickly, the kind of practice physical assessment that medical training makes automatic, systematic, thorough. She watched him. He checked airways, breathing, circulation. He looked at the surface injuries. He checked the pupils, and she watched his face for the moment of recognition and saw nothing. He moved on. "Standard trauma protocol," he said to the room. "CT of the head and cervical spine, chest x-ray, full metabolic panel. Let's get him to imaging." "Dr. Hale," Emily said. The room got slightly quieter. Not because she'd been loud, she hadn't been, but because there was something in her voice that the room responded to before anyone had consciously registered it. Even she recognized it. It was the voice she'd used in places where being wrong wasn't a recoverable situation. Hale turned to look at her slowly. "Did I ask for input?" "No, sir. But this patient may have been poisoned." The word landed in the bay like a stone into still water. "Excuse me?" "The pupillary asymmetry doesn't match the head trauma. It's the wrong pattern. His skin presentation and the mucosal discoloration suggest something systemic, not external. And there's a mark on his left wrist near the radial artery site that looks like a subcutaneous injection, not a crash laceration." She kept her voice flat and factual. "I think we need a toxicology screen before imaging, and I'd recommend getting a toxicologist on the phone right now." Hale stared at her. Then he laughed. Not a loud laugh, a short, sharp expulsion of breath that contained within it more contempt than most people could pack into a paragraph. "You are a probationary nurse on your 3rd day. You are standing in my emergency bay, in the middle of a trauma response, telling me, a surgeon with 30 years of experience, that I've missed a poisoning diagnosis. I'm not saying you missed it. I'm saying the evidence. What evidence? A mark near a wrist?" He turned back to his resident. "Document the nurse's concern for the chart. Get the patient to CT." He looked back at Emily with the specific flatness of a man who had already made up his mind. "And you, stay in your lane." Emily's jaw tightened. She watched the resident mark something on the chart, probably a single cursory line, probably under the heading of nursing staff concern, notation made. And she looked at the patient's face, and she thought about the mark on his wrist and the slightly blue corners of his lips, and the way his pupils weren't doing what they were supposed to do. She thought about a forward operating base, and a man on a dusty concrete floor whose pupils had looked just like that. She thought about what had happened to that man in the 40 minutes it had taken for anyone to believe her. She looked at Hale's back as he spoke to his resident. She made a decision she knew she would not be able to walk back from. The crash cart was on her left. The medication cabinet required a key card access that she had because she was on shift, and her badge worked every cabinet in the ER. The override protocol, the one that allowed nursing staff to initiate emergency treatment without physician order in cases of imminent life-threatening emergency. existed in exactly the manual she'd spent 2 weeks studying before her first shift. She moved to the medication cabinet. "Carter," Donna's voice, low and urgent from 3 feet behind her. "What are you doing?" "I need the atropine." She was already scanning her badge. "And I need you to get a toxicologist on the phone." "Emily," the mark on his wrist. "It's a delivery site. Subcutaneous, not IV. Something timed. Something that was already in his system when the crash happened, maybe even caused it." She pulled the cabinet open. "If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. If I'm right and we take him to CT first, he'll be dead in the imaging machine." "You are not authorized to—" "I'm initiating an emergency override. It's in the protocol, page 47. She pulled what she needed, moved to the workbench, and began preparing. "Call the toxicologist, please." Donna stood very still for 2 seconds. Then she picked up the phone. Hale had his back to the medication cabinet. He was still talking to his resident, something about the CT queue and the priority order, when he heard the sound of the override protocol alert, a soft triple tone that meant a nurse had initiated emergency treatment. He turned around. He saw Emily Carter with a syringe. "What?" He crossed the bay in 6 steps, and his voice had abandoned any pretense of professional calm. "What is she doing? Somebody stop her right now." Emily had the IV access already. She'd moved with a speed and precision that stopped Donna mid-sentence and made the paramedic near the door take an involuntary step back. She was not moving like a probationary nurse on her 3rd day. She was moving like someone who had done this in conditions so much worse than a clean hospital bay that the clean hospital bay felt almost easy. "Stop!" Hale reached her arm and grabbed it, not hard enough to be assault, hard enough to be a statement. "You are not authorized to administer anything to this patient. He's going to crash." She did not look at him. "You have approximately 2 minutes to let go of my arm, or you will be watching him code in front of your entire staff." "You are fired," Hale said. "As of this moment, you are no longer employed by this hospital. Security." "Someone call security," said one of the residents, unnecessarily, because security was already coming through the bay door. 2 men, neither of them happy about being in a trauma bay, both of them walking toward Emily with the careful approach of people dealing with a situation they hadn't been trained for. Emily looked at the patient. She looked at Hale. She looked at the syringe in her hand, and then she administered the medication. Hale's face went through several things in rapid succession: shock, fury, the specific color shift of a man whose authority has just been publicly and completely ignored. "Take her out," he said very quietly. "Right now." The security officers reached her. One of them put a hand on her shoulder. She didn't fight it. There was no point in fighting it, and she knew it. And she let them guide her back from the patient's gurney and toward the bay entrance. Her hands were steady. She noticed that about herself and filed it away. She looked back at the patient as they moved her toward the doors. His face, the bluish tinge at the corners of his lips, the slow rise and fall of his chest. She had done what she could do. Donna was still on the phone. Emily could see her across the bay, speaking rapidly, one hand pressed to her other ear to block the noise. The security officers walked Emily through the bay doors and into the corridor. The corridor was quiet, in the way that medical corridors go quiet when something has happened that everyone has heard about, and nobody wants to be too close to. A nurse's aide at the far end pretended to be interested in a supply cart. A resident who'd been walking toward the bay had stopped and reversed a direction. "We're going to take you to administration," said the security officer to Emily's left. He was young, trying to sound firm, not quite landing it. "Dr. Hale has requested your badge." "I know," Emily said. They walked. Emily put her hands in the pockets of her scrubs to keep from doing anything with them. She thought about the atropine she'd administered and what it would do in the timeline and whether she'd caught it in time and whether the mark on his wrist was what she thought it was, or whether she was about to discover that she'd just destroyed her nursing career over a bruise. She thought about Route 9, mile marker 44, a government fleet vehicle with no skid marks. She thought about what kind of person rides in a government fleet car alone on a mountain highway at 10 in the morning. They were 20 feet from the bay doors when they heard it. The monitor alarm, the specific cascade of tones that means a patient's vitals are doing something they are not supposed to do. Not a single alarm, but the layered overlapping sequence that means multiple systems responding at once. She knew that sound. She'd heard it in places where the walls shook and the dust fell from the ceiling and there was no time to think, only to move. And then, from inside the trauma bay, she heard something she had not heard from Dr. Marcus Hale in 3 days of working under him. She heard him shout, "He's crashing! Somebody get in here! He's crashing!" The security officers both turned toward the sound. In that half second, that involuntary human reflex of turning toward a crisis, Emily Carter slipped her arm free, turned around, and walked back through the bay doors. The patient's monitor was screaming. His blood pressure had dropped. She could see the numbers from the doorway, a free fall in numbers that shouldn't be going that direction that fast. Hale was at the head of the gurney, and he was shouting for a crash cart, and the resident was frozen, and Donna was off the phone and moving, and it was that specific, beautiful, terrible chaos that emergency medicine becomes when everything goes wrong at once. Emily walked through it like it was weather. "Move," she said, to no one in particular, and everyone at once, and something in her voice made people move. She reached the patient's side. She looked at the monitor. She looked at his face. She checked his pulse at the throat, rapid, weak, the specific quality of a cardiovascular system under chemical attack, and she knew, with the absolute quiet certainty of someone who has been here before, exactly what was happening and exactly what needed to happen next. "I need the atropine I gave him reversed. It's not the right approach for this compound. I made a partial error in the mechanism." She didn't hesitate over the admission. There was no time for ego. "I need epinephrine. I need a different line. And I need someone to tell me what that toxicologist said." "She can't be in here," Hale said, but his voice had lost something. The authority was still there, but the certainty behind it had cracked because his patient was crashing and he didn't know why, and she clearly did. "Donna," Emily said, "what did the toxicologist say?" Donna was across the gurney. Her face was doing several things at once. "She's not on staff anymore, Dr. Hale." "Donna!" Emily's voice was flat and calm in the way that flat and calm becomes its own kind of urgency. "What did the toxicologist say?" A half-second's pause. The monitor continued its noise. "Modified organophosphate compound," Donna said. "Unknown delivery mechanism. She's never seen the specific pattern in a civilian case." Emily was already moving. She worked with the efficient economy of someone who has learned to do difficult things with insufficient supplies in impossible conditions, and what she did in the next 4 minutes, the specific sequence of interventions, the improvised approach to countering a compound that the hospital's toxicologist had said she'd never seen in a civilian case, made 3 different people in that trauma base stop what they were doing and stare. "Where did she learn that?" someone said. Nobody answered. Hale stood at the edge of the activity and watched with the expression of a man who is watching something he doesn't understand and cannot stop, and isn't sure he should stop. And that expression, that crack in the absolute certainty he'd worn all morning, was something Emily would have found satisfying under other circumstances. Right now, there were no other circumstances. There was only the man on the gurney and the compound in his blood and the monitor, which was still alarming but differently now. Not the freefall alarm of a system in full collapse, but the jagged, urgent alarm of a system fighting back. "Keep the line open," she said to the resident, who nodded without looking away from her hands. "And someone needs to get his personal effects photographed before anyone handles them, particularly anything in his jacket pockets." "Why?" said the resident. "Because whatever he was carrying might tell us whether this was accidental or deliberate. And right now I'm leaning very hard toward deliberate." The monitor shifted again. One of the alarms dropped out of the cascade, then another. Emily watched the numbers. She watched his face. She watched the slow, labored rise and fall of his chest, even out slightly. Still not right, still not safe, but no longer the free fall of 3 minutes ago. She let out a breath she hadn't consciously been holding. "He needs ICU," she said. "And someone needs to make sure his attending physician understands the compound profile before they adjust any of his medications." "You don't work here," Hale said. His voice was quiet. "I know." She stepped back from the gurney. "But he's still alive." The room was very quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of a space where something significant has just happened, and nobody is quite sure what to do with it yet. And then, from outside, they heard it. Not loud at first. a distant rhythmic thudding that the building's walls absorbed and softened into something that could almost be confused with equipment, or HVAC, or any of the dozen mechanical sounds a hospital makes all the time. But it grew. Emily heard it before anyone else reacted to it, because she recognized the specific frequency, the overlapping rotors of multiple aircraft flying in tight formation, the bass vibration that precedes the sound by just enough to make the windows hum. Someone near the bay window said, "What is that?" One of the residents moved toward the window and looked up and out and said, "Absolutely nothing," for 3 full seconds, and then said, "Those are military helicopters." The windows of the trauma bay were vibrating now, not shaking, vibrating, the fine-edge frequency of heavy aircraft making a rapid descent to a location very close to where they currently were. The ceiling lights flickered once. A supply tray rattled on its shelf. Hale looked at the windows. He looked at the patient on the gurney. He looked at Emily. Emily looked at the patient. The man who had arrived unconscious in a government fleet car from a single vehicle accident on a stretch of mountain highway with no skid marks, a modified organophosphate compound in his blood, and a delivery mark on his wrist that had nothing to do with the crash. The man whose personal effects were in a sealed bag on the shelf to her left. The man that nobody in this hospital, including her, had been told anything about. Outside, the sound of rotor blades dropped to a low, organizing pulse that meant something had landed, multiple somethings. And she could hear, under the rotors, something else now, the sound of boots on exterior pavement, organized, purposeful, the specific cadence of people who move in formation. Hale's phone rang. He looked at the screen, and whatever he saw there made his face do something Emily had not seen from him in 3 days. He looked uncertain. He answered, listened, said nothing for 4 seconds. Then, "Yes, I understand." He hung up. He looked at Emily across the gurney, across the still alarming monitor, across the gap between what he'd believed this morning and what had happened since. The bay doors opened, not the regular swing of someone walking through them. The specific deliberate opening of someone who was used to entering rooms and immediately owning them. The man in the doorway wore civilian clothes, but stood with a posture that civilian clothes couldn't disguise, and behind him were 2 others who were not in civilian clothes at all, whose presence in a trauma bay was so wildly contextually wrong that it produced a specific frozen moment in every person in the room. The man looked at the patient on the gurney. He looked at Marcus Hale, and then he looked at Emily Carter. He held her gaze for exactly 3 seconds, with an expression that she could not immediately read, not recognition exactly, but something adjacent to it, something that suggested her name was not new to him. Behind him, through the bay windows, Emily could see the parking lot. It was no longer a parking lot. It was something else entirely. Black vehicles in precise formation, uniformed figures taking up positions she recognized without having to think about it. The organized perimeter of people who were very serious about what they were protecting. Her hands, for the first time since she'd walked back through those bay doors, were not completely steady. The man in the doorway hadn't moved. He stood with the particular stillness of someone who had learned a long time ago that stillness itself was a form of authority, and he was looking at Emily with an expression she still couldn't fully decode. Not warm, not cold, something measuring and careful that made the back of her neck prickle. She became aware, in the stretched-out quality of that moment, of how she must look. Scrubs with someone else's blood on the left sleeve. Hair that had come partially loose from its clip sometime in the last 20 minutes. Hands that were not quite steady. Standing in a trauma bay she'd been fired from 6 minutes ago, next to a patient she'd been escorted away from, in a hospital that had just had its parking lot converted into something resembling a forward staging area. She straightened anyway. The man stepped fully into the bay. He was somewhere in his late 50s, lean in the way that men who've spent decades in physical professions stay lean, with close-cropped gray hair and a face that had been weathered by enough different climates to make it hard to pin down. He was wearing a dark jacket over a collared shirt, no tie, and he moved through the trauma bay like someone who'd spent enough time in difficult spaces to stop being impressed by them. Behind him, the 2 uniformed figures positioned themselves at the bay entrance without being told to, not guarding the door exactly, just present. Hale found his voice first. "This is a restricted treatment area. I don't know who you are, but you cannot—" "Dr. Hale." The man didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. I need you to step back from the patient. Excuse me. Step back. Still not loud, still completely non-negotiable. Hale stepped back. He looked like he hated himself for it, but he stepped back. The man moved to the patient's side and looked at him, not the way a doctor looks at a patient, assessing vitals and injury patterns, but the way someone looks at a person they know and are very worried about. It lasted only a few seconds. Then he looked at the monitor, at the IV lines, at the medication documentation on the bedside tray, and something in his face shifted slightly. He turned to Emily. "You're the one who treated him." It wasn't a question, but she answered it anyway. "Yes. Modified organophosphate, subcutaneous delivery, right wrist." He said it like he was confirming something he'd already known or suspected. "What did you use for the counter protocol?" Emily told him. The specific sequence, the dosage adjustments, the improvised approach to the secondary effect. She gave it to him in the flat, factual shorthand of someone reporting to a superior, which was not a mode she'd used in 3 years, and which came back with an unsettling ease. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "That protocol isn't in any civilian medical literature," he said. "No," she agreed. "It isn't." He held her gaze for another moment. Then he turned to one of his staff, a woman Emily hadn't noticed entering, dark-haired, 30s, with a tablet and the brisk manner of someone managing 17 things simultaneously. "I want a full toxicology team in here in the next 15 minutes. I want his medication chart locked to authorized personnel only, and I want this bay swept for anything that shouldn't be here." "Yes, sir." "And get Dr. Reyes her temporary facility authorization reinstated." He glanced at Donna, who was standing very still near the chart station, with the expression of someone watching a situation evolve faster than she can track it. "She'll be the primary nursing coordinator for this patient going forward." Donna opened her mouth, closed it, nodded. Hale's face had gone through several things in quick succession and had landed somewhere between outrage and a very specific kind of fear that Emily recognized as the fear of someone who has just realized the room has gotten much larger than they thought it was. "I don't know who authorized you to make staffing decisions in my hospital. Your hospital administrator does." The man reached into his jacket and produced a single folded document. He held it out to Hale. "You'll want to read that before you finish that sentence." Hale took the document. He unfolded it. He read it. The color left his face in a slow, measured way that reminded Emily of watching someone's blood pressure drop on a monitor, gradual, visible, not good. This can't be." "It is, and it can." The man had already turned away. He looked at Emily. Can you walk me through the treatment timeline from when the patient arrived?" And just like that, Emily Carter, who had been fired, who had been dragged out by security, who had been called unauthorized and reckless and worse, was standing in the middle of the trauma bay walking a federal operative through a treatment protocol, while the chief of surgery stood at the edge of the room holding a document that had apparently removed several of his certainties. She walked him through it. Every step, every decision point, every moment where she'd chosen the non-standard approach, and why. She did not editorialize. She did not justify. She reported, cleanly and specifically, and he listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he nodded once. "Good," he said. Just that. She waited for more and didn't get it, which was, she thought, probably appropriate. The next 40 minutes were controlled chaos of a different kind than the trauma bay chaos of an hour ago. This was organized, purposeful, the specific efficiency of people who operate under institutional structures that don't require consensus or committee approval. The hospital's toxicology team arrived and was immediately briefed by the man's staff. 2 individuals Emily didn't recognize, neither in uniform nor in anything that looked quite like civilian clothing, moved through the trauma bay with equipment she recognized the shape of, but not the specific iteration of, running sweeps. She understood the purpose of without needing to be told. Emily stood to the side and watched. At some point, someone brought her a cup of coffee. She hadn't asked for it. She didn't know who'd brought it. She drank it anyway because her hands were finally, stubbornly, slightly trembling, and she needed something to do with them. Donna appeared at her shoulder with the specific quiet of someone who has decided to be careful about what they say. "How are you doing?" I'm okay. That's not really an answer. I know. Emily looked at the patient, stable now, genuinely stable, the monitor doing what monitors were supposed to do. Who is he? Nobody's told us anything. I know that too. She looked at the man in the dark jacket who was on a phone call near the bay entrance, speaking in the low, contained way of someone who has information they're being careful with. He's not a bureaucrat, the way he moves, the way he talks. Donna was quiet for a moment. The people outside, she said. I looked out the front entrance. How many vehicles? I stopped counting at 7, and there are people in positions around the building that I think are, she paused. I think they're security perimeter, like actual perimeter. Emily said nothing. Emily, Donna's voice dropped lower. What did that man do? The patient. What is he? I don't know. You have an idea. I have several ideas. Emily looked at the sealed bag on the shelf, the patient's personal effects, which no one had opened since she'd asked for them to be photographed. But right now, I'm a fired probationary nurse standing in a trauma bay on someone else's authorization, so I think I'll keep my ideas to myself. Donna looked at her for a long moment. For what it's worth, she said, what you did in here today, that was... She stopped. I don't have a word for what that was. You don't need one. Donna nodded and went back to her charts. The man in the dark jacket finished his phone call. He stood at the bay entrance for a moment, looking at nothing in particular, with the expression of someone processing information and running contingencies. Then he looked at Emily and made the smallest possible gesture, a tilt of the head toward the corridor. She followed him out. The corridor was empty in a way corridors in busy hospitals are not usually empty, which meant someone had cleared it, which meant someone had anticipated having a conversation here that they didn't want witnessed. Emily noted this without comment and stood facing the man with her arms at her sides and her coffee cup still in her left hand. How long have you been here? He asked. At this hospital. 48 hours before today. And before that? I transitioned out of government service 14 months ago. She used the phrasing deliberately, government service, which was technically accurate and practically said nothing. I've been working toward my nursing credentials since. I know what your credentials say. He looked at her with the direct attention of someone who is not interested in the version of the story you want to tell. What I'm asking is where you've been, because we lost track of you about 8 months ago and... He paused very slightly. That's unusual. Emily looked at him steadily. I wasn't aware I was being tracked. You were. She absorbed that. Why? Because people who know what you know don't just stop existing. He said it without particular inflection, which made it more unsettling than if he'd said it with weight. And because the kind of training you have tends to be relevant at unexpected moments. He looked back through the bay window at the patient. Like today. Emily said nothing. His name, the man said, is not something I'm going to give you in a hospital corridor. What I will tell you is that what he was carrying when that vehicle went off Route 9 is not something that can be discussed here, and that what happened to him today was not an accident. He looked back at her. The compound in his system is not something you find in a chemistry textbook. It's not something a civilian operation produces. Someone with specific resources and specific knowledge wanted that man to die quietly in what looked like a single vehicle accident, and they came very close to succeeding. Emily thought about the crash site. No skid marks. The vehicle drifted. It didn't veer. Whatever had happened to him had been happening before the crash. Someone knew his route, she said. Someone knew his route, his schedule, and his vehicle's security override codes. The man's voice was flat. We're still working on the how. Emily looked at the patient through the window. He's going to need monitoring for the next 6 to 8 hours minimum. The compound has a secondary activation pattern. I've only seen it twice before, and both times there was a delayed cardiovascular response 12 to 16 hours after initial treatment. Someone needs to know what to watch for. Will you write it up? She looked at him. I'm fired. Not anymore. She waited. The administrator of this hospital received a call 32 minutes ago, the man said. Your termination has been suspended pending review. You're on temporary duty status, which means you work for me for the duration of this patient's stay. You report any clinical developments directly to my staff, and Dr. Hale's authority over this patient's care is suspended." "Suspended?" Emily said. "Not removed. For now." She heard what he wasn't saying and filed it. "And after?" "After depends on a lot of things." He looked at her with the same measuring expression he'd had when he walked in. "One of which is what you write up for me in the next hour." She nodded slowly. "I'll need access to the tox panel results." "You'll have them." She turned back toward the bay, stopped. "I don't know your name." "No," he agreed. "You don't." She went back into the bay. The next 2 hours had the quality of a shift that has been fundamentally reorganized around a single patient. The facility's toxicology consultant, a tired-looking woman named Dr. Marsh, who had driven in from off-duty and clearly resented it until she saw the compound profile, at which point she stopped resenting it and started looking alarmed, worked alongside Emily in a careful, initially tense collaboration that smoothed out once they'd established that they were both primarily interested in the patient's survival rather than in territorial precedence. "I've never seen this specific binding pattern outside of a classified pharmacology paper," Marsh said quietly while they were reviewing the tox results together. "A paper that I technically shouldn't have had access to." "Same paper," Emily said. Marsh looked at her sideways. "Who are you?" "Nursing staff." Emily turned back to the results. "Look at the secondary metabolite here. This is going to be the problem in 12 hours. His system will start trying to clear it, and the clearance process itself triggers a vascular response that looks like a cardiac event," Marsh said. "That will look exactly like a cardiac event. And if whoever's monitoring him at that point doesn't know what they're looking at, they'll treat it like one and they'll crash him themselves." Emily tapped the relevant result. "We need to flag this for the ICU team with very specific instructions." Marsh was quiet for a moment. "How do you know all of this?" Emily didn't answer. Marsh seemed to decide that was an answer in itself, and they went back to the results. At some point in the early afternoon, Dr. Hale reappeared. He didn't come into the bay. He stood in the corridor outside, and Emily was aware of him the way you're aware of weather changing, a shift in the air, a change in the quality of light. She didn't look at him directly. She was writing up the clinical notes Marsh needed for the ICU handoff. And she kept writing, but she clocked his position and the position of the man in the dark jacket staff member who materialized near the bay entrance with the specific quiet of a reminder. Hale did not come in. He stood there for perhaps 3 minutes, looking through the window, and then he left. The patient's transfer to the ICU happened at 2:47 p.m. Emily walked alongside the gurney, not leading it, not directing the transfer team, just present in the way that she'd been asked to be present. A specific kind of attendance that wasn't quite authority and wasn't quite consultation, and was probably something that didn't have a name in the hospital's official org chart. In the elevator, for 30 seconds, there were only 4 of them. Emily, the patient, one of the man's staff members, and a transfer nurse named Walt who had been specifically cleared for this particular patient and who asked no questions, which Emily suspected was because he'd been told not to. She looked at the patient in the elevator. In the cleaner, steadier light outside the trauma bay, with his wounds cleaned and his color improved slightly from the absolute gray of a man in systemic crisis, he looked like what he was, someone substantial, someone who had once been very physically capable, and still was, despite the years that showed in the lines of his face and the gray at his temples. He had the hands of someone who had worked in harsh conditions for a long time. She thought about what the man in the dark jacket had said, what he was carrying when the vehicle went off Route 9. She thought about the sealed bag of personal effects, which had been photographed and then removed from the trauma bay by someone she hadn't been introduced to. She thought about the secondary activation pattern in the compound and the 12 to 16-hour window. She thought about the fact that someone had known his route, his schedule, and his security codes. The elevator opened. They moved the patient to ICU room 4, which had been cleared of its previous occupant, relocated, she gathered, rather than discharged, and set up with monitoring equipment that was partially the hospital's standard setup and partially something that had been brought in and installed by people she didn't recognize in the last hour. She gave the ICU charge nurse, a meticulous man named Brian, the full briefing on the secondary activation pattern. She watched him absorb it and saw the moment it landed, the specific change in his expression when he understood what she was telling him, which was that the danger wasn't over. 12 to 16 hours, he said. Starting from initial exposure or from treatment? From initial exposure, best estimate, which we don't know exactly, so the window is wider than I'd like. She wrote the monitoring parameters on the nursing note with the kind of specificity that left no room for misinterpretation. If you see these specific values together, not individually, they'll appear individually as normal variation, but in combination in this sequence, you call me directly. Not the attending, not the overnight resident. Me. Brian looked at the note, looked at her badge, looked at the man near the door who had been there since the elevator, nodded. Okay, he said. She walked out of the ICU and found the man in the dark jacket waiting for her in the corridor with a paper cup of water and a manila folder that he held out without preamble. She took the folder, opened it. The contents made her stop walking for a moment. These are the personal effects photographs, she said. Yes. She looked at the image on the second page. The patient had been carrying, among other things, what appeared to be a standard encrypted drive in a government-issue carrier case. The carrier case was intact, but the drive itself, she could see the base of it in the image, had a specific physical modification, a small secondary component barely visible, attached to the casing. Someone modified the drive. This isn't part of the original hardware. We noticed that too, the man said. This is a tracking component. She looked at him. Someone modified the data device he was carrying. That's how they knew his route. The device itself told them. The man's expression didn't change, but something around his eyes did. When did you develop a familiarity with surveillance hardware modifications? Emily thought about a deployment in a location whose name she never wrote down and didn't say aloud, and about a briefing on compromised equipment that had preceded a very bad week. I've had some exposure. We're running the drive now, he said. The technical team thinks there may be a secondary function beyond tracking. She looked at the photograph again. How long has he had this drive? 12 days. She thought about the timeline that implied. Whoever had done this had done it in the last 12 days, which meant they'd had access to the patient's equipment within the last 12 days, which meant the compromise wasn't external, or at least wasn't only external. She closed the folder and held it out. Keep it, the man said. I want your notes on everything you flagged. You see things differently than my technical people. She tucked the folder under her arm. Are you going to tell me who you are? Does it matter right now? Not operationally, no. He almost smiled. It didn't quite make it to completion. Reeves, he said, deputy director, though that title means less than people think it does. She nodded. She did not ask which agency because she suspected the answer was the kind that came with a specific weight of consequence. She wasn't ready to put on herself in the middle of a hospital corridor at 3 p.m. She walked back toward the nursing station to write up her notes, and she was 3 steps away when Reeves said behind her, Carter? She stopped. The administrator is reinstating you formally, he said. Full nursing staff status, probation suspended. Not because of me, because the hospital has decided it's the appropriate response. She turned around. But Hale is contesting it, Reeves continued. He's filed a formal complaint. Unauthorized treatment, patient endangerment. It went through the medical board liaison 20 minutes ago. He said it without particular emotion. I wanted you to know before you heard it from someone else. Emily considered this. Hale, who had watched her save his patient and had spent the 2 hours since talking to administrators and lawyers rather than dealing with the clinical reality in front of him. Hale, who had watched a probationary nurse do something he hadn't been able to do and had responded by reaching for the paperwork. What does the complaint do? It triggers a review. Normally, that would put you on suspension pending the review's outcome. He paused. In normal circumstances. These aren't normal circumstances. No, he held her gaze. But Hale doesn't know that yet. And until the review formally initiates, you're in a gray area, which means you can be here and you should be here, but you need to be careful about how visibly you're practicing. Emily absorbed this. A formal complaint filed while the patient she'd treated was alive in the ICU because of what she'd done, while federal personnel occupied the hospital parking lot, while the man whose authority Hale was hiding behind had just told her she reported directly to his staff. He really doesn't understand what's happening here, does he? Not yet, Reeves said. Most people don't, until they do. She went to write her notes. She found a quiet alcove off the main corridor, sat in a chair that was slightly too small for comfortable extended sitting, and wrote for 40 minutes without stopping. The clinical documentation went quickly. That part of her brain had always worked faster than she wanted it to, organizing information into the specific architecture of medical notation with the ease of something practiced until it was automatic. It was the other part, the part that kept circling the modified surveillance component in the photograph, the secondary activation window, the 12-day timeline, the absence of skid marks on Route 9, the fact that Reeves had said we lost track of you 8 months ago. That kept pulling her attention sideways. Someone had compromised the patient's equipment 12 days ago. They'd known exactly how to time a compound that would look like a medical event that looked like an accident. They'd known enough about the specific pharmacology to source a compound that Harlow County General's toxicologist had never encountered outside a classified paper. This was not an amateur operation. She thought about Hale, about his reflexive dismissal in the trauma bay, not just arrogance, which she'd encountered and learned to work around in a dozen different settings, but something that had functioned almost like certainty in the face of contradictory evidence. She'd seen his face when the patient crashed. He'd been surprised, genuinely surprised. The crash wasn't what he'd expected. She pushed that thought aside. It was incomplete, and incomplete conclusions were more dangerous than no conclusions. She finished her notes, logged them in the system under the temporary access Reeves's staff had set up, and stood up from the alcove chair with the specific stiffness of someone who has been running on adrenaline for 6 hours and is now being notified by their body that the invoice has arrived. She needed to eat something. She needed to sit somewhere that wasn't a hospital chair. She needed 6 hours of sleep, which she was not going to get. She walked back toward the main corridor and almost ran directly into Donna, who was moving fast in the opposite direction with an expression that Emily had not seen on Donna's face before. "What's wrong?" Emily said. Not a question. "Hale." Donna stopped, lowered her voice. "He's been in the administrator's office for the last hour, but 10 minutes ago he came out and he went—" She glanced toward the elevator bank. "He went up to the ICU." Emily was already moving. "Brian called me," Donna said, keeping up. "He said Hale came in and said he was resuming oversight of the patient in room 4, cited his standing as chief of surgery. Reeves suspended his authority over that patient. Hale's position is that Reeves's authorization doesn't supersede his clinical authority within the hospital." Donna hit the elevator button. "He's in there right now. Brian called me because he didn't know who else to call." The elevator took 15 seconds. Emily spent them calculating. Hale in the ICU room, the patient in the 12 to 14-hour vulnerability window, the monitoring parameters she'd established, and the specific values that, in combination, meant "call me directly." The elevator opened. She went in. On the 4th floor, the ICU corridor had the low specific tension of a unit where something is about to happen. Brian was outside room 4 with the particular posture of someone in an institutional standoff, not physically blocking the door, but present in a way that made his position clear. Inside the room, she could see through the glass panel. Hale, standing at the patient's bedside, looking at the monitoring equipment with an expression that she could not fully read from the corridor. She went through the door. Hale looked up. His face did something complicated and then settled into the specific coldness of someone who has made a decision and is committed to it. "You have no business being in this room." "Neither do you," Emily said. "Your clinical authority over this patient was suspended this afternoon." "By whom?" "A man who walked into my hospital with a piece of paper and by someone with the authority to do it, which you know because you read the document. I have a patient in this room. You have a patient in this room whose monitoring parameters are specific and documented, and whose clinical situation is considerably more complex than it appears right now." She kept her voice down because the ICU required it, not because she particularly wanted to. "If you touch his medication chart or alter his monitoring setup, you could kill him, not through malice, through ignorance of what he was given and what his body is doing with it. Hale's jaw tightened. I am the chief of surgery at this hospital, and he is going to go into a vascular crisis in the next 2 to 8 hours if the monitoring isn't exactly right. She was across the room now, between Hale and the patient's medication chart. I know you filed the complaint. I know what it means for me, but right now that is not what matters. And if you have any interest in this patient surviving the night, you will step back and let me manage this. The monitors beeped steadily. The patient breathed. Outside the window, the late afternoon light was turning the sky the particular blue-gold of high-altitude Colorado in early fall, and it would have been beautiful if Emily had been able to look at it, which she could not. Hale looked at her. He looked at the patient. He looked at the chart. You think you can walk in here, he said very quietly, and take over. You've been here 3 days. I know. She didn't move. I know how that looks. You know nothing about how this hospital works. You know nothing about these people, these patients, this system. I know what's in his blood, she said, and I know what's going to happen to him tonight if someone doesn't manage it correctly. She held his gaze. That's enough for right now. Something moved across Hale's face. Not capitulation. He was not a man built for capitulation, but something adjacent. The specific recalculation of someone who has been certain and is being forced by the specific weight of evidence to be less certain. He stepped back. He didn't leave the room. He moved to the far side of the bed and stood with his arms crossed and his expression controlled, and he watched. Emily turned to the monitoring equipment and began the verification check she'd established for Brian, running through the parameters one by one, logging the current values, comparing them against the baseline she'd set 2 hours ago. The numbers were fine. Normal range, well within the window she'd marked as stable. She let out a careful breath and started making notes. She was 4 lines into her notation when the monitor changed. Not alarmingly, not the cascade of tones from the trauma bay. A single quiet shift in one value, moving to the edge of the range she'd marked, then past it by 1 point, then 2. She looked at the value, looked at the secondary values beside it, checked the combination against what she'd told Brian. Her hand went still on the notation pad. Brian, she said without turning around. Brian was through the door in 4 seconds. He looked at what she was looking at. Get Marsh, Emily said. Right now. She was already moving, pulling on gloves, her hands finding their position at the bedside with the same automatic authority they'd found in the trauma bay that morning. And someone needs to call Reeves. Hale was behind her, very still. What's happening? The secondary event, Emily said. It's early. She looked at the monitor, at the patient's face, at the values climbing past the threshold she'd feared. It shouldn't be early. The timeline... She recalculated, reconsidered. Something was wrong with her assumptions about the exposure time. The initial exposure was earlier than we thought, which means... She looked at the patient's IV lines. One of them was wrong. Not obviously wrong. Not the wrong color or the wrong attachment. But the drip rate on the secondary line was different from what she'd set, different from what she'd documented. And the bag... She checked the bag label against her notes. The bag was not what she'd ordered. She looked at it for 1 full second, processing. Then she looked at the room, at Brian, who had just come in, at Hale, who had been here when she arrived, at the door, which had a keycard log. Who changed this line? She said. Nobody answered. The monitor ticked up another point. The patient's breathing changed, subtle, barely perceptible. The kind of change that a person who hadn't been listening for it would have missed entirely. Emily heard it. She looked at the IV line, she looked at Hale. She looked at the door to the ICU room, which had opened 2 minutes before she'd arrived, according to the keycard log visible on the wall panel. According to the log, it had opened twice. The first time was when Hale had entered. The second time was from the inside, 9 minutes ago, with a keycard that logged as maintenance access, and she had not seen anyone come out. She scanned the room. The bathroom door was slightly ajar. Not much. An inch. Maybe less. Emily Carter moved. She crossed the room in 4 steps. The bathroom door had that specific quality of stillness that isn't stillness at all, the held breath quality of something on the other side of it that knows it's been noticed. Emily had learned the difference between an empty room and a room pretending to be empty in places where getting it wrong had a permanent cost. And she was not wrong now. She hit the door with her shoulder hard and low, driving through it rather than pushing it, and the resistance she felt on the other side was human and male and caught off balance, which was the best she was going to get without a weapon. The man was bigger than her by 40 pounds and had been prepared for discovery, just not for how fast it came. He had something in his right hand. She didn't look at what it was. She grabbed the wrist, leveraged it against the door frame with a force that produced a sound she recognized as something in the hand not cooperating with the angle, and the object he'd been holding, a small device, medical-looking, something she'd have to deal with in a moment, dropped to the tile floor. He shoved back. She didn't have the weight to absorb it cleanly, and she knew it, so she didn't try. She redirected, let him push her backward, used his own momentum to turn him into the doorframe with his arm behind him at the angle that makes further resistance a question of how much pain tolerance a person has. He had some. Not enough. "Brian," she said, completely level, like she was asking him to hand her a chart. "Call Reeves. Right now." Brian was already on the phone. Through the rush of blood in her ears, she could hear him on the other end, speaking fast and low, and then the specific tone shift of someone who has gotten through to the right person. Hale was against the far wall. He'd pressed himself there when she'd gone through the bathroom door, and he was still there, his face doing something she'd seen on faces before. Not the face of someone who is frightened for a stranger's safety, but the face of someone who is calculating. That was interesting. She filed it. The man in her grip said something, not words, the compressed nonverbal of a person in pain making a decision. "Don't," Emily said quietly. He made the decision anyway. He tried to drive his head back into her face, which was a reasonable choice if she'd been where he expected her to be. She wasn't. She'd moved laterally when she'd felt the tension change in his shoulder, the specific pre-movement signal of that particular technique, and his head found the door frame instead of her nose, which produced a sound and an amount of immediate cooperation that resolved the situation. She took him to the floor. He went down hard and stayed down, which told her something about the head contact with the doorframe. Not unconscious, she could see him breathing, could see him trying to reassemble himself. But the decision-making window had closed for the next 30 seconds, which was enough. She looked at the device on the tile floor, small, cylindrical, with a medical-grade port fitting on one end. She did not touch it. She looked at the man, at his clothing, maintenance uniform, Harlow County General logo on the left breast, but the shoes were wrong. Maintenance staff wore work boots. These were tactical sole construction in a neutral color, the kind of footwear chosen to be unobtrusive in a medical facility without sacrificing the things you might need in a shoe if the situation changed. She looked at his hands. The one she'd cranked against the doorframe was already swelling wrong, but the other one had calluses in the specific locations that come from a particular kind of repetitive training. Not hospital work, not maintenance. Brian was still on the phone. From the corridor outside, she could hear the specific approaching sound of people moving with purpose. Not running, which would create panic in an ICU, but the fast, controlled walk of people who'd gotten the message. She stood up from the man on the floor, stepped over the device, and went back to the patient's bedside. The monitor was doing what she'd feared when she'd seen the IV line. She stripped the compromised line cleanly, capped it, and began working with the equipment on hand. The standard ICU setup, which was not ideal but was workable if she was specific about it. Her hands moved through the process with a competence that she was no longer thinking about, because thinking about it would slow it down, and slowing it down was not an option. "What's in the line?" she said to herself, not really to anyone. "What do you need?" Donna. Emily hadn't heard her come in, but there she was, reading the room in about 3 seconds and coming to the bedside without being asked. "The bag that was on the secondary line. It's on the floor near the door. Don't touch it directly. I need to know what's in it. Get it to Marsh." "On it." The door opened wider. 2 of Reeves's personnel came in, not the same 2 from the trauma bay, different ones, and they assessed the man on the bathroom floor with the brisk professional attention of people who had handled this kind of situation before and found it routine. One of them crouched beside him. The other stood and looked at Emily. "You okay?" Fine. Don't let him move until Reeves sees him. She didn't look up from the patient. And the device on the tile floor is evidence. Do not let it get lost in the shuffle. Copy. The patient's monitor shifted again. The value she'd been watching climbed past the secondary threshold she'd established. Not the point of no return, not yet, but past the point where she could manage it with the ICU's standard formulary alone. She needed something specific. She looked at what Brian had available, ran the arithmetic in her head, made 3 decisions fast about substitution and dosage adjustment, and started working. Hale was still against the wall. "Dr. Hale," she said, without turning around, "I need you to leave this room." He didn't move. "This is my hospital. That man on the floor was going to put something into this patient's IV line." She kept working. "That's why the secondary line rate was wrong when I got here. He'd already made 1 adjustment and was about to make the second." She looked at the monitor. "So either you didn't know what was happening and you walked into a room that had already been accessed by someone who wants this patient dead, in which case you need to leave so I can do my job. Or you did know, in which case you need to leave even more." The room was very quiet. Reeves came through the door. He took in the man on the floor, the device near the bathroom, Emily at the bedside, and Hale against the wall, and his face did nothing visible except tighten very slightly at the corners of his eyes. He looked at his personnel, got a nod, looked at Emily. "Status. Compromised secondary line, I've stripped it. Managing the vascular response now, we're in the early window, which is actually better than I expected. If I can stabilize the progression in the next 20 minutes, we're okay." She didn't pause in what she was doing. The man on the floor had a delivery device, at same port fitting as the IV line he'd already accessed. I don't know what was in it. We'll find out. He looked at Hale. Something passed across his face that might have been the specific form of recognition that comes from a person seeing a piece fit into a pattern. "Dr. Hale, I need you to come with me." "I'm not going anywhere until—" That wasn't a request. Reeves's voice was still quiet. It had the quality of something that didn't need volume to be immovable. "My people will escort you. Please don't make it difficult." Hale looked at Emily. She felt it without turning around. The specific quality of a look from a person who has just realized that the situation has become something they cannot manage through the channels they've spent 30 years building. She heard him move, heard the door. Then it was quiet except for the monitor and Donna moving efficiently beside her and the low voices of Reeves's personnel securing the man on the floor. Emily worked. The 20 minutes she'd estimated became 23 because the second value spiked in a way she hadn't fully modeled, requiring a recalculation mid-sequence that cost her time she didn't have and forced 2 improvisations she wasn't entirely comfortable with but executed anyway because the alternative was worse. At minute 19, she thought she'd made an error in the dosage conversion and spent 45 seconds going back through her math with the specific cold focus of someone who cannot afford to spiral. She hadn't made the error. The number was right, but those 45 seconds cost her something she couldn't quantify. At minute 23, the monitor settled. Not all the way. Not to the baseline she wanted, but to the range she'd defined as manageable, to the set of values that meant the patient's system was fighting back and the fight was a fair one. She stood still for a moment. Donna was beside her, not saying anything, which was exactly right. "Okay," Emily said, mostly to herself. She looked at the monitor for 5 more seconds, memorizing the values. Then she began documenting. The documentation took 40 minutes, and she did it in the ICU alcove where Brian could see her through the glass, and she could see the patient's monitor through the glass, and everyone was aware of everyone else, which was how it needed to be right now. Reeves appeared at the alcove entrance at some point during the second half of her documentation. He sat down in the chair across from her, which was something she hadn't seen him do before. He was a man who stood as a general operating principle, and he put a folder on the table and left his hand on it without opening it. "The device," he said. "The one from the bathroom. It contained a fentanyl-adjacent compound, high concentration, fast onset. In the patient's IV line, in the dosage calibrated for his body weight." He didn't finish the sentence. "It would have looked like a cardiac event," Emily said, "same as the secondary activation. That was deliberate. The compound caused enough vascular disruption first, The fentanyl event on top of it would look like the patient's body finally failing from the original trauma. She set down her pen. 2-stage. The first stage creates the clinical noise. The second stage creates the death. And both stages look like medicine, not murder. Reeves looked at her steadily. That's a sophisticated operational design. It required someone who understood both pharmacology and clinical presentation well enough to construct a cover story that would survive an autopsy. She held his gaze. That's not a contractor. That's someone with training. He opened the folder. The first page was a photograph. Not the maintenance worker. She'd expected that. Expected to see the face of the man from the bathroom floor. Instead, it was a document. Financial. Account numbers, transaction records, dates. We pulled this in the last 2 hours, Reeves said. It was in a system we've been monitoring for a separate investigation. The account on the left received a transfer 11 days ago. The account on the right belongs to a private contractor with DOD adjacent relationships. He tapped the page. The account on the left belongs to an individual with system access to this hospital. Emily looked at the account identifier. She was not a financial investigator. She couldn't read the routing details or the institutional identifiers, but she could read the access code in the upper left corner of the transaction record, because it was the same format as the code she'd seen all day on the hospital's own keycard system. She looked at Reeves. That's a hospital staff credential code, she said. Yes. Whose? He turned the page. She looked at the name, looked at it for a long moment. How long have you known? She asked. We suspected for 6 hours, confirmed in the last 40 minutes. He closed the folder. The complaint he filed against you this afternoon is part of the record now, not because it matters to your reinstatement, it doesn't, but because it establishes a pattern of behavior designed to remove you from this patient's care. Emily sat back in the chair. The alcove was small and slightly too warm and smelled like the industrial cleaning product that hospitals use on floors. And she was aware of all of it in the specific over-sharp way that happens when adrenaline has been running too long and the body is trying to recalibrate. He knew what was in the patient's blood, she said. In the trauma bay, when I told him it wasn't trauma, he wasn't dismissing me because he thought I was wrong. He was dismissing me because I was right and I wasn't supposed to notice. That's our assessment. He knew the crash was coming, or the event. He knew something was happening to that patient before the ambulance arrived. She was thinking out loud, which she didn't usually do, but Reeves was listening with the focused attention of someone who found this useful, and she kept going. When the patient crashed in the trauma bay, he looked surprised, but not frightened, not the way a physician looks when their patient crashes and they don't know why. He looked surprised, like someone whose schedule has been disrupted. He expected the patient to be in imaging, Reeves said. The compound's timeline was calibrated for a patient who received standard trauma care and was transferred to CT within the first 20 minutes. If the patient had been in imaging when the secondary activation hit, it would have killed him in the machine, Emily said, and it would have been attributed to the head trauma from the crash. She closed her own folder. I interrupted the timeline by an hour. You interrupted it by treating him before imaging. Yes. She thought about the trauma bay, Hale's hand on her arm, the security officers. The word fired, said very quietly, with the specific satisfaction of a man who believes he's in control of the situation. She had been in control of the situation. She just hadn't known that yet. She thought about the secondary line in the ICU room, the maintenance worker, the 2-stage design. Even after she'd interrupted the first timeline, someone had adapted and sent a secondary option within the same afternoon. That was fast. That was either very good planning or very responsive coordination. The maintenance worker, she said. Was he already in the hospital before the patient arrived? Reeves's expression told her something before he spoke. His access log shows he entered the building at 6 this morning, 4 hours before the call came in. 4 hours before. That meant he'd been positioned before the crash, which meant either the crash had been coordinated to deliver the patient to this specific hospital, which required either incredible logistical control or extraordinary coincidence, or the operation had been designed to work wherever the patient ended up, with an asset in place at multiple facilities. How many hospitals on Route 9's corridor, she asked. 5 that could have received him as a primary trauma. Reeves paused. We're checking the others. She absorbed the scale of that. This isn't just an operation against one person, she said slowly. "This is an infrastructure." He didn't confirm it, and he didn't deny it, which was a kind of confirmation. She looked through the glass at the patient. He looked smaller in the ICU bed than he had on the trauma bay gurney, which was a common phenomenon and never stopped being somewhat striking, the way the clinical environment reduced people to their physical vulnerability. He was stable. He was alive. He would be alive tomorrow, she was increasingly confident, if the next 12 hours went the way she intended them to go. The intelligence he was carrying, she said, the modified drive, being analyzed. Whatever's on it, it's relevant to the infrastructure you just described, isn't it? Reeves looked at her for a long moment. Why do you think that? Because the operation against him is too sophisticated to be about one person. You don't build a multi-facility asset network and a two-stage medical assassination protocol to eliminate an individual, even an important one. You do it to eliminate what they're carrying and prevent what they know from getting somewhere. She held his gaze. Which means whatever he was bringing in is either evidence of something or a key to something, and whoever wants him dead wants what he's carrying dead with him. Reeves stood up. He picked up the folder. He looked at her with an expression that contained something she hadn't seen from him before. Something that wasn't quite respect, because she suspected he reserved that word for a narrow set of circumstances, but was in the vicinity. "I need to make some calls," he said. "Stay in the building." "I wasn't planning on leaving." He went. Emily sat in the alcove for another few minutes. She finished her documentation. She looked at the patient through the glass and she thought about the modified drive and the 12-day window and the maintenance worker who'd been in the building since 6 in the morning, and she felt the shape of something large moving just outside her line of sight, the way you feel a weather system before you can see the clouds. She stood up and went back to check the patient's monitor. Brian was at the nursing station. He looked tired and alert in equal measure, which was the ICU night shift combination. He'd been thorough with the monitoring logs since she'd given him the parameters, and everything was documented to the standard she'd asked for. She told him that. He nodded and didn't say much, which she was starting to understand was his way. "You okay?" he asked, which surprised her slightly. "Yes." "You've been here since before 7 this morning," he said. "You fought a guy in a bathroom." "That's accurate." "You don't have to stay." She looked at the patient's monitor through the glass. "I'll be here until the secondary window closes." She looked at Brian. "The next critical check is at 2 a.m. Can you call me an hour before just in case I fall asleep somewhere?" "You going to sleep here?" "There's a call room on 3. He looked at her for a moment. "I'll call you at 1, he said. She walked to the elevator. The hospital at 9 in the evening was a different organism than the hospital at 7 in the morning. Quieter, slower. The daytime urgency replaced by the specific vigilance of a skeleton crew managing the same complexity with fewer hands. The lights in the main corridors had shifted to the lower register night setting that was supposed to be easier on patients, but mostly just made the staff look tired. She hit the button for 3 and stood in the elevator and let herself, for the first time all day, simply be still. Her shoulder ached where she'd hit the bathroom door. Her hands, she noticed, were actually shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the simple depletion of a body that had been running too hard for too long. She'd had coffee in the morning and the cup someone had given her in the afternoon and nothing else, and she was suddenly aware of this in an urgent way. The elevator opened on 3. The call rooms were at the end of the corridor, small rooms with a narrow bed and a phone and a hook on the wall and nothing else, the minimum necessary to allow a person to be horizontal for 4 hours without losing immediate access to wherever they needed to be. She'd slept in worse. She'd slept in significantly worse. She found an empty one, sat on the edge of the bed, considered lying down and dismissed it for the moment because she needed to think, and thinking horizontal had a risk profile she couldn't afford. She thought about Hale, about Reeves taking him out of the ICU room with the specific certainty of someone securing an asset rather than managing a difficult physician. About the financial records in the folder, account codes, transaction dates, the hospital credential identifier in the upper left corner. She thought about the complaint Hale had filed against her, the formal grievance submitted through the medical board liaison designed to suspend her pending review. Submitted not in the heat of the trauma bay moment, that would have been anger, and she'd have understood anger, But 2 hours later, after she'd been reinstated by the administrator, after Reeves's personnel had taken over the facility's security posture, after it had become clear to anyone paying attention that what had happened today was not a standard medical dispute, he'd filed it anyway, deliberately, with full information about what was happening around him, which meant either he was the most arrogant man she'd ever encountered, and the competition for that position was not small, or he'd filed it because it served a purpose beyond the obvious. Because creating a formal medical board record of Emily Carter as unauthorized and dangerous was useful to someone, and that someone had asked him to create it while there was still time. She was missing something. She lay back on the bed without deciding to, her eyes closed. She was not asleep. She knew the difference, had trained herself to maintain the thinnest possible layer of awareness in rest situations. When her phone buzzed on the bed beside her. Not Brian, not yet. It was 9:15 and he wouldn't call until 1. She looked at the screen. Unknown number. Which in her life, historically, meant something specific. She answered. Carter. The voice on the other end was not Reeves. It was not anyone she'd spoken to today. It was a voice she had not heard in 14 months, a voice that belonged to a period of her life she had specifically relocated to Clearwater, Colorado, to leave behind. She sat up. How did you get this number? She said. It wasn't a question. The same way we get most things. A pause. You've had an interesting day. Yes. You need to listen to me very carefully. The voice had the specific quality of urgency compressed under professional control, the way you talk when you need someone to understand that what you're saying is important without giving them the chance to argue before you've said it. The man in room 4. Reeves thinks this is about what he was carrying, the drive. It's not. The drive is real. What's on it is real. But the drive is also how they found him. A pause. Carter, the modification to that drive wasn't done by outside contractors. The tracking component was installed by someone with full access to the patient's secure equipment protocols. She was very still. How deep does that go? She said. We don't know yet. That's why I'm calling you instead of Reeves. She understood what that meant. She understood it fully and immediately, and felt it land in her chest with the weight of something she'd been successfully avoiding thinking about for the last several hours. You're telling me the compromise isn't just the hospital, she said. I'm telling you to be very careful about who you trust with what you know tonight. Another pause. And I'm telling you that the patient in room 4 has a secondary problem that has nothing to do with the compound in his blood. What secondary problem? The drive contains something more than intelligence files. The voice was lower now, quieter. It contains a recording. Names, Carter. Individuals embedded in federal infrastructure who've been running assets against domestic and international targets for 18 months. The kind of names that... A brief silence. The kind of names that explain why the operation against him was sophisticated enough to require a multi-facility asset network. She stood up from the bed. Her body had stopped caring that it was tired. Who else knows about the recording? She said. That's the problem. The voice paused one more time, and this pause was different from the others. Longer, weighted with something she'd heard in it before, years ago, in a completely different context. Reeves's team found the drive 3 hours ago. They've had it for 3 hours. And 40 minutes ago, someone with access to Reeves's secure communication sent a message to an outside number. She was already at the door. Carter. The voice, very quiet now. The names on that recording. One of them is in that building right now. The call ended. She stood in the doorway of the call room on the 3rd floor of Harlow County General and looked at the empty corridor and thought about the ICU on 4 and Brian at the nursing station and the patient in room 4 and Reeves somewhere in the building making calls. And she thought about a message sent 40 minutes ago from a secure line to an outside number. And she thought about the maintenance worker who had been in position since 6 in the morning. And she thought about the second stage of a 2-stage operation. And then she thought about something she hadn't thought about before, because she hadn't had the information. The maintenance worker, when she'd taken him down, had been moving toward the IV line. But he'd been moving toward a specific IV line. Not the primary line, the secondary line, the one that had already been adjusted. He hadn't come to make the first adjustment. He'd come to make the third, which meant someone had already made the second. She was running before she finished the thought. The stairwell door hit the wall when she went through it. 4 flights up was 4 flights, which was 30 seconds if she pushed, and she pushed. Her shoulder screamed on the landing turns where she hit the rail. She didn't slow down. She came through the 4th floor door into the ICU corridor, and she saw, from 40 feet away, Brian's chair at the nursing station, empty. The corridor had the specific quality of a space where something has just changed, the way a room feels after a sound is stopped, the absence of something that should be present. She went through the ICU door. Room 4's glass panel showed the patient in the bed, the monitor running, the equipment in place. And standing at the bedside with a tablet in one hand and the primary IV line in the other was someone she recognized. Not from today. Not from the trauma bay, or the corridor, or the ICU. From the photograph in Reeves's folder, the one she'd looked at and processed and filed because her brain did that automatically, because it had been trained to match faces to records without requiring conscious instruction. She knew the name that went with the face. And the face was not the maintenance workers. She went through the door. The man at the bedside heard her and turned in the same motion. Not the startled turn of someone caught doing something they shouldn't, but the controlled pivot of someone who had been tracking the door with peripheral attention and had been waiting for this moment to arrive. That told her something. She'd been hoping for the startled version. His name was Garrett Saul. She knew that from the photograph in Reeves's folder, cross-referenced against the hospital credential code in the financial record. Deputy Director of Clinical Operations for Harlow County General, which was an administrative title that meant he controlled system access, vendor relationships, procurement, and the kind of institutional infrastructure that allowed a maintenance worker to have keycard access to an ICU room at 9 in the evening without anyone asking questions. He was in his mid-40s, medium build, the kind of face that was specifically unremarkable. The face of someone who had spent a career in rooms where being noticed was a liability. He was wearing a jacket over a collared shirt and holding the tablet like it was a normal thing to be holding at the bedside of a restricted patient at this hour. "Miss Carter," he said, completely steady, "you shouldn't be on this floor. Put down the IV line." He looked at his hand, at the primary line he was holding, then back at her, with the specific expression of someone who is deciding how to play the next 30 seconds. "I'm doing a clinical systems audit. This patient's documentation, put it down." Something shifted in his face. Not fear, she'd been wrong about the startled version, and she was not wrong about this. He wasn't afraid. He was recalibrating. "You don't have any authority here. You were terminated this morning. Whatever temporary status you've been given by Reeves's people doesn't extend to— Where's Brian?" A pause. "The charge nurse. I asked him to pull a file from— Where is he?" Another pause, longer, and in that pause she read the thing she'd been afraid of since she'd seen the empty nursing station chair. She moved past Saul to the monitoring panel and checked the call log. Brian had been dispatched to the records room on 2 at 8:53, 7 minutes ago, which was long enough. She looked at the patient. His vitals on the monitor were— she checked twice to make sure she was reading it right, slightly altered from what they'd been 40 minutes ago when she'd last looked through the glass. Not dramatically. A degree of change that would be easy to attribute to normal variation. Easy to miss if you didn't know exactly what to look for. Someone had already started. She looked at Saul. He was reading her face and she let him, because what she needed right now was for him to believe he still had options, and that meant not showing him what she was about to do. "How long?" she said. "I don't know what you're— How long has this been running? The network, the assets?" She kept her voice level. "Because the compound used on this patient isn't something you source from a standard black market channel. That took institutional access, military pharmacology research, probably 18 months minimum to develop and field test." She watched him. "You've been at this a long time." Something moved in his expression. Not pride. She'd misjudged that in people before. But something more complicated. The look of a person who has carried a large secret for a long time and is tired. "You're a nurse," he said. "You've been here 3 days. You don't understand what this is." "I understand enough. You understand a patient and a compound and a financial record. You don't understand the infrastructure. What's at stake? He set the tablet down on the bedside table, which she tracked, and clasped his hands in front of him, which she also tracked. The man in this bed has been collecting information about operations that have kept this country functional for 8 years. Operations that require certain accommodations that don't survive public disclosure. So you tried to kill him. We tried to stop a disclosure that would destroy careers, programs, and relationships that cannot be rebuilt. His voice was patient. The voice of someone explaining something to a person they believe is intelligent but uninformed. You stopped a carefully designed operation at significant cost. You should understand what that means going forward. She understood what it meant. It meant he was still talking, which meant he was still assessing, which meant he hadn't made the decision yet. The one she could see him approaching, the one where the conversation became something different. She also understood that the patient's vitals had moved, and that whatever Saul had done to the primary line in the minute before she'd come through the door had a timeline she didn't know. She moved to the primary line. He moved to stop her. She'd been expecting it, and she was already accounting for the angle. He was larger than the maintenance worker, but slower, the kind of slow that comes from years of physical inactivity wrapped inside institutional authority. And she had 3 steps on him before his hand came up. She stripped the primary line with her right hand and stepped left and let him go past her into the bed rail, which produced a sound he wasn't expecting and bought her the 3 seconds she needed to check the line's port. There was a residue. Barely visible, clear, clinging to the inside of the port fitting. She didn't need a lab to know what it was. She'd seen the device from the bathroom floor, and she'd seen the port fitting on it, and the residue matched. He hadn't used the device. He'd used something smaller, something he'd brought himself, something that had already delivered its payload before she'd come through the door. She looked at the monitor. "How much?" she said. He was against the bed rail, rubbing his forearm where he'd caught it, and his expression had finally dropped the patient, administrative professional affect and become something more honest. Enough. She was already at the medication cart. The ICU had what she needed, not the ideal formulation, not the specific counter she'd have chosen if she'd had 30 minutes to prepare. But she had 30 seconds, and she used them with the same terrible efficiency she'd been using all day, pulling what she could work with and calculating on the move and getting the line in clean and setting the rate, and then standing at the bedside watching the monitor with the fixed attention of someone who has done the thing and cannot now do anything except wait for the evidence of whether it was right. 45 seconds. Saul didn't try to leave. She noticed that. He stood at the edge of the room and watched her work and said nothing, and she didn't look at him because she couldn't split her attention right now. But she kept him in her peripheral vision the way she'd been trained to keep threats in her peripheral vision in situations where looking directly at them wasn't tactically available. The monitor held. Then it improved. Marginally, incrementally, the specific slow correction of a system that has been pushed and is pushing back. She let out a breath. Then she looked at Saul. He was watching her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Undisguised, unstrategic, the naked look of a person who has just watched something happen that they hadn't believed was possible. "How did you know what he used?" he said, not challenging, genuinely asking. "I've been paying attention all day," she said. "It's what I do." She picked up the room phone and called Brian's extension in the records room. He answered on the second ring, confused and slightly annoyed in the way of a person who's been sent on a task they didn't quite understand. She told him to come back to the floor immediately and to call Reeves on his way. She did not explain further. Then she looked at Saul and said, "Sit down." He sat, which told her, more than anything else that had happened in the last 4 minutes, that something in him had reached the end of whatever calculation he'd been running. She'd seen it happen to people before, the specific moment when the operational mindset disengages and the human being underneath it surfaces, blinking into what the situation actually is. She did not feel sorry for him. She noted the absence of that feeling and moved on. Reeves came through the door 3 minutes later with 2 of his people behind him and Brian at his shoulder, looking like a man who has walked into a story he's not sure he's qualified for. Reeves looked at Saul sitting in the chair, looked at Emily at the bedside, looked at the monitor. He read the room in the practiced way of someone who has read a lot of rooms. "You need to brief me," he he said to Emily. Primary line was accessed. I've administered counter-treatment. Monitor looks stable. I need Marsh up here to verify my dosage calculation because I was working fast, and I want a second set of eyes on it. She said it all in one breath. Saul administered something through the primary port. I don't know the exact compound, but the residue profile matches the device from earlier, so assume same family. He can tell you more than I can. Reeves looked at Saul. The look lasted about 2 seconds and contained something Emily chose not to examine too closely, because it was the look of a man who has found the piece he's been looking for and is not pleased about what finding it means. Garrett, he said, just the first name. Quiet. Saul looked at the floor. I want counsel. You'll get it. Reeves looked at his personnel. They moved to either side of Saul with the efficiency of a procedure that had been done before. You'll get everything you're entitled to. He watched them take Saul's arms and stand him up, and then he looked at Saul's face with an expression that Emily could not fully decode. Something old in it, something that looked like it had history. I'm going to ask you one question before they take you out. One, and you can decline to answer. Saul looked at him. The recording on the drive, how many people on that list are still active? A long pause. The ICU room was very quiet, except for the monitor doing its steady, reassuring work. All of them, Saul said, and let himself be walked out the door. The next hour was operational in the way that hours become operational when a situation has broken open and the people managing it are moving fast to contain what's spilling out. Marsh arrived and verified Emily's dosage calculation. She'd been right, which she'd been fairly confident of but was relieved to confirm, and made 2 small adjustments that Emily agreed with, and they stood side by side in the ICU room for a while in the specific companionable silence of 2 people who have been working the same problem from different angles and have arrived at mutual respect without having had a conversation about it. Reeves's people moved through the hospital with the controlled urgency of a search that had been waiting for a trigger. Emily heard it, the sound of doors, footsteps, the low radio traffic of personnel coordinating, and she didn't follow it because her job was in room 4 and she knew it. Brian came back to his station and resumed his logs with the specific stoic focus of a man who has decided that the only appropriate response to an extraordinary situation is to do his ordinary job extraordinarily well. Emily was grateful for him in a way she didn't express, because the moment didn't call for expression. At some point, she realized she was sitting in the chair beside the patient's bed. She didn't remember deciding to sit. Her body had made the decision independently, which happened sometimes when the adrenaline finally stopped its work and the physical reality of a 14-hour day presented its invoice without asking. She looked at the patient's face. He had not regained consciousness. He would not, Marsh had said, for at least another several hours, possibly longer depending on how the compound metabolized. But his color was better, genuinely better, not the slightly better than terrible of the trauma bay, but the color of a person whose body was doing the thing it was supposed to do. His breathing was regular. The monitor was boring. Emily found boring extremely beautiful at this particular moment. She was still in the chair 20 minutes later when Reeves came back. He looked tired in a way he hadn't looked before, which was the first time she'd seen something like a human operating limit on him. He stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the room, and then came in and stood near the window with his hands in his jacket pockets. Hale, she said, in federal custody. He's been cooperating for the last 40 minutes, which means either he's smarter than he acted or he's more frightened than he acted. Probably both. Reeves looked at the patient. The financial records go back 22 months. He received 6 transfers, the last one 3 days ago. Each payment corresponded to a specific action: delaying treatment, routing patients, creating documentation gaps. He paused. He's done this before. Not assassination, or not directly, but facilitation, making certain patients harder to save. Emily absorbed that. The specific coldness of it, not dramatic, not the operational violence of the maintenance worker, but the institutional slow cruelty of a physician who had taken money to be slightly less good at his job at the right moments. She thought about how many times she'd watched him dismiss a concern in the trauma bay. How many times she'd seen him look past something. How many patients, she said. Reeves didn't answer, which was an answer. She looked at the floor for a moment, then she looked up. The names on the recording, Saul said they were all still active. Yes, and Saul was one of them. Saul was one of them. The operation against this patient was partly self-protective. His name is on the recording. But he was also maintaining a layer of the infrastructure. Reeves shifted slightly. The network is larger than this hospital, obviously, but this hospital was a node, a controllable environment where assets in transit could be managed if needed. A medical facility, Emily said. Because you can do things in a medical facility that look like medicine. Yes. She thought about what Saul had said, operations that have kept this country functional for 8 years. The specific language of a person who has committed to a framework that turns crime into necessity. She'd heard versions of that framework before, in different contexts with different specific crimes at the center, and the framework was always the same. The necessity argument, the greater good argument, the argument that the rules were made for people who didn't understand the full picture. It was always the argument of people who had decided the rules applied to everyone except themselves. The drive, she said, is it intact? The technical team finished their initial pull 2 hours ago. The recording is there. He paused. The names are there. 47 individuals. Federal, military, 1 judiciary appointment. He said it flatly, like a man reading from a list. It's going to be a difficult several months. Are you on it? He looked at her. No. She held his gaze. I had to ask. I know. He didn't seem offended. I'd have asked too. She stood up from the chair. Her legs were stiffer than she'd expected, which was what sitting in a hospital chair for an extended period did to a body that had already been through the kind of day this one had been. She stretched briefly and professionally and looked at the monitor one more time. I'm going to the call room, she said. Brian has my number. The next check. I know the protocol, Reeves said. You wrote it. She nodded, moved toward the door. Carter. She stopped. The complaint Hale filed. The medical board review. Reeves's voice was even. It's been withdrawn. The administrator contacted the board liaison 30 minutes ago. Your reinstatement is full and permanent, effective immediately. She stood with her hand on the doorframe. Okay, she said. That's all you've got? She thought about it. About the morning, about the badge that said probationary and the 7 minutes late, and the coffee stain and the way Hale had looked at her across the trauma bay like she was furniture. About the word fired, said quietly. About security's hand on her shoulder, and the corridor, and the people who hadn't quite been able to look at her as they'd walked her out. For now, she said. Yeah. She slept 4 hours. Not well. The call room pillow had the specific texture of a pillow that had been washed 1,000 times and retained the memory of none of them, and her shoulder ached where she'd hit the bathroom door, and somewhere around the 2nd hour she sat up with her hands reaching for something that wasn't there. The old reflex, the bad one, and had to count backward from 100 again. But 4 hours was 4 hours. She'd made it on less. Brian called her at 1, as promised. The patient was stable. The 2 a.m. check was clean. She documented it and went back to the call room and slept another 90 minutes, and woke up before her alarm because her body did that. She was in the ICU at 5:30 when the patient opened his eyes. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the movie version of regaining consciousness. No gasping, no sudden sitting upright. It was the slow, incremental process of a heavily sedated person working their way back through the layers, eyelids moving first, a slight increase in muscle tone, a change in the quality of his breathing that Brian noticed on the monitor before Emily noticed it at the bedside. Hey, she said quietly, when his eyes were open enough to suggest he was tracking. You're at Harlow County General Hospital. You're safe. He looked at her. His eyes were unfocused in the way of someone processing through pharmaceutical fog. His lips moved. She leaned closer. The drive, he said. The words were barely there. Abraded, effortful, the voice of someone working against significant sedation to produce something important. The recording. We have it, she said. It's safe. Reeves has it. Something in his face shifted. Not relief exactly, more like the specific detensioning of a person who has been holding something for a very long time. She could see it in the muscles around his eyes, the slight change in the set of his jaw. You're the medic, he said, still barely audible. I was, she said. Right now I'm a nurse. He looked at her for a long moment with the slightly out-of-focus intensity of someone trying to see clearly through circumstances that won't quite allow it. Then his eyes closed again. His breathing evened into the rhythm of someone going back under, not in crisis, but in rest. She stepped back from the bedside. Reeves was in the doorway. She hadn't heard him arrive, which was something she made a note to examine when she had time, because she should have heard him. She was slipping. He spoke, she said. I know, I was listening. He came into the room, looked at the patient. He'll be coherent in a few hours. He wanted to know about the drive. First thing a man like him asks about. There was something in Reeves's voice that was close to warmth. Not quite, but close. He's been carrying that thing for 12 days, knowing what was on it, and knowing what it would mean if he got it to the right people, and knowing what would happen if he didn't. He looked at the monitor. 12 days. Emily looked at the patient's face, the lines in it, the gray at his temples, the hands on the blanket, wide and worn. 12 days carrying the kind of secret that makes everyone around you a potential threat. What's his name? She said. Reeves considered for a moment. Voss? Colonel Daniel Voss, retired. Or nominally retired. He paused. He came back for one specific thing. The recording was his. She absorbed that. Voss had collected it, had gone back in, nominally retired, to collect the evidence of 47 people doing things that required a quiet man with a government fleet car and a mountain highway and 12 days to disappear with it. He's going to be okay, she said. Not a question. Because of you, yes. She looked at the monitor one more time. The numbers were good. Everything was where it was supposed to be. The patient, Voss, breathed with the steady, purposeful rhythm of a body that intended to continue. She went to the nursing station and wrote her morning notes. The hospital came alive around her in the way hospitals come alive in the early morning, the shift change, the day staff arriving, the specific increase in ambient sound and light that marks the transition from the skeleton crew's careful vigilance to the daytime's broader, noisier operation. She watched people arrive, watched faces she recognized from the previous day and faces she didn't, watched the elevator open and the corridors fill. At 7:15, the hospital administrator, a compact, precise woman named Dr. Lenora Pask, who Emily had been introduced to briefly the day before and had not spoken to since, appeared at the ICU entrance and asked to speak with her. They stood in the corridor. Pask looked tired in the way of someone who had been on the phone most of the night, and she had the expression of a person performing an action that is simultaneously necessary and uncomfortable. The hospital, Pask said, owes you a formal apology. Emily waited. What happened yesterday? Dr. Hale's conduct, the termination, the way you were removed from the building was improper. Regardless of the other circumstances we were unaware of at the time. Pask held her gaze. I'm formally documenting the apology and having the record corrected. Your probationary period is waived. You're being reinstated at full staff status with credit for your service date. A pause. I also want to say personally that what you did yesterday was extraordinary, and I'm sorry we made it as difficult as we did. Emily looked at her. Pask was not performing this. She was doing it with the specific discomfort of someone who means what they're saying and finds the saying of it harder than they'd expected. Thank you, Emily said. It wasn't everything she felt, but it was what the moment called for, and she'd learned that giving the moment what it called for was usually more useful than giving it everything you felt. Pask nodded and left. Emily leaned against the corridor wall for a moment. The day was starting around her. Brian's relief had arrived. A woman named Carla, who Brian was briefing with the specific thoroughness of someone who takes seriously the act of handing off. The monitor in room 4 was visible through the glass, still running its steady, reassuring numbers. She thought about what Reeves had said. All of them. 47 names, still active. She thought about what Saul had said in the ICU room, the look on his face when she'd countered what he'd administered, the specific surprise of a man who had structured an entire operation around the assumption that a probationary nurse with 3 days on the job could be managed, dismissed, filed, and removed from the situation, and had been catastrophically wrong about that. She pushed off the wall and went to check room 4 one more time. Voss was asleep. His color was good. The monitor was boring and beautiful. She stood at the glass for a moment, watching, and then she turned and walked back toward the nursing station. She was halfway down the corridor when her phone buzzed, the same unknown number as the night before. She answered. "There's something you need to know," the voice said without preamble. "About the withdrawal of Hale's complaint. Reeves handled that. Reeves thinks he handled it, but the withdrawal was submitted through the medical board liaison 23 minutes before Hale was taken into federal custody." A pause. "The timeline matters, because the withdrawal contained a condition." She stopped walking. "What condition?" "The complaint was withdrawn in exchange for a formal letter, submitted by the medical board liaison to Harlow County General's administration." The voice was careful, specific. "The letter recommends that Emily Carter's nursing license be referred for independent review on grounds of unauthorized practice administered outside the scope of her credentials." She stood very still. "Reeves doesn't know about this because it went through a separate channel, the board liaison, who is not a federal entity and whose communications were not under Reeves's oversight." The voice paused. "Carter, the liaison is on the list." She heard it, let it land. The 47th name on the recording that Voss had carried 12 days across a mountain highway. The medical board liaison, whose official institutional function was to serve as the bridge between a hospital's medical staff and the state's licensing authority. Hale had withdrawn his complaint, but before he'd done it, before he'd been arrested, before he'd known what was coming, he'd used it, had converted it from a blunt instrument into something surgical, had filed a referral through the one channel that Reeves's oversight hadn't covered, using a contact who had the authority to make that referral stick. The complaint was gone, but what it had generated was already in motion. "How long do I have?" she said. "The referral was submitted this morning. Review board meets in 10 days. Until then, you're technically authorized to practice, but..." A pause. "Whoever wanted you out of that hospital yesterday is making sure that if everything else fails, there's still a mechanism." She looked at the door to room 440 feet away, at the glass panel, at the monitor showing its steady, boring, beautiful numbers. She thought about 14 months of hiding in a mid-sized mountain town, about choosing Clearwater because it was quiet, about a badge that said probationary, and a burned piece of toast, and a bus she'd missed, and 7 minutes late, and a man who'd looked at her like furniture. She thought about the medical board liaison, whose name was on a recording that was currently in the hands of Reeves's technical team, whose communications Reeves hadn't been monitoring, who had submitted a referral this morning. "Does Reeves know the liaison is on the list?" she said. "He will in approximately 2 hours when his team finishes the full analysis of the recording." "Then I have 2 hours," she said, "to make sure that when he finds out about the list, he already knows about the referral." She hung up. She stood in the corridor of the 4th floor of Harlow County General Hospital with the morning light coming through the windows at the angle that meant it was not quite 7:30, and she thought very carefully for about 45 seconds. Then she turned around and walked back toward the ICU, not to check room 4, to find Reeves. She found him in the small conference room the hospital had given over to his team, a room that had been a routine scheduling meeting space yesterday morning and was now papered with printed documents and populated by 3 people working laptops with the specific focused silence of people who have been at it all night and intend to keep at it. He looked up when she came in. Read her face. "What?" he said. She told him. He was very still for the length of time it took her to tell it. Then he picked up his phone and looked at the screen and set it back down and looked at her. "The referral is already filed," he said. "Yes." "Which means, even if I have the liaison's activities shut down in the next hour, the referral exists as a submitted document in the board's intake system and has to be formally withdrawn through legitimate board process, which requires a board member with authority to intervene," she said. "Yes, I know." He looked at her. He looked at the wall of documents behind her. He looked at his personnel, one of whom was already pulling something on their laptop with the focused speed of someone who had just been given a new target. "I need 20 minutes, he said. She nodded, turned to go. "Carter." His voice had something in it, not the measuring quality of the first time he'd said her name in the trauma bay doorway, but something else, something she didn't have a clean word for. You could have called from the corridor. You didn't have to come in person. She thought about why she'd come in person, about the specific decision to walk into the room rather than make the call, to put herself in his line of sight rather than in his ear, to be present rather than reportable. I wanted to see your face when I told you, she said, to make sure you understood it wasn't theoretical. He held her gaze. And? You understood, she said, and left the room. She stood in the corridor outside and leaned against the wall and closed her eyes for a moment. 10 seconds. The length of time she'd learned to take when a situation required the next thing, and the next thing was not yet clear. The next thing was clear. It was simply not comfortable. She opened her eyes. The sun was properly up now, coming through the east-facing windows in flat golden slabs that lit the dust in the air and made the corridor look, briefly, like something out of a different kind of story, a quieter one. She watched the light for a moment and thought about Clearwater, about the reason she'd come here, about a fresh start that had turned out to be something else entirely. She pushed off the wall. She had patience to check and notes to finish and a day to get through, and somewhere in the next 2 hours, Reeves's team was going to find the 47th name on a list that a retired colonel had carried 12 days across a mountain highway, and whatever happened after that was going to require her to be upright and clear-eyed and present. She was 3 steps down the corridor when she heard, from inside the conference room, one of Reeves's personnel say something sharp and urgent in a low voice, and then Reeves's response, 2 words, bitten off, the sound of someone receiving information that has changed the shape of what they thought they knew. She stopped, turned around. Reeves appeared in the conference room doorway. He looked at her. His face had the quality of something that has just been rearranged. The 47th name, he said. She waited. It's not the liaison, he said. The liaison is on the list, but not as the 47th name. There are 48 names. The last one, he stopped. She could see him deciding how to say it. The last name on the recording is someone who had access to this investigation, to the drive, to everything. She felt something cold move through her. Someone who knew Voss was carrying the recording, she said. Someone who knew about it 8 months ago. He held her gaze. When we lost track of you. The morning light came through the windows. The monitor in room 4 kept its steady rhythm. Somewhere in the hospital, the day shift was fully underway, the ordinary business of medicine, of caring for people, the work she'd come here to do. Emily Carter stood in the corridor and looked at Reeves's face and understood, with the cold certainty of someone who has learned to trust that feeling, that the last 12 hours had not been the end of something. They had been the beginning. Who? She said. Reeves looked at her for a moment that was slightly too long to be comfortable, not the measuring look from the trauma bay doorway, something more complicated, something that had weight in it. Someone at the agency level who's been running parallel oversight on this investigation for the last 8 months. Someone who knew Voss had gone back in. Someone who knew about the recording's existence before Voss extracted it. Someone who could have stopped it. Someone who was supposed to. He held her gaze. Someone who didn't, and who made sure we lost track of you when you went quiet, because you were on a list of people who might recognize what Voss was carrying if it ever surfaced. She heard that and let it settle, and felt the particular cold of a betrayal that operates at altitude, not the knife in the back kind, not the personal kind, but the institutional kind, the kind where the wrong is so embedded in structure that it doesn't look like wrong from inside the structure, it just looks like policy. Is this person in this building? She said. No. Reeves's voice was flat. They're in Washington, and they know we have the recording. They've known for approximately 6 hours, which is how long they've had to prepare. She thought about what 6 hours of preparation looked like for someone with agency-level access and 47 colleagues on a list who were all, simultaneously, becoming a problem. What are you doing about it? Right now? I'm talking to you. He said it without irony. Because you're the only person in this building whose position on that list I'm certain of. He paused. You're not on it. I want to be clear about that. I know I'm not on it. I know you know. He looked at the conference room, at his people working their laptops, at the stack of printed documents on the table. We have the recording, we have the financial records. We have Hale in custody, and Saul in custody, and the maintenance operative in custody, and the medical board liaison's communications being subpoenaed as of 40 minutes ago. He turned back to her. What we don't have yet is the person who built the architecture, the 48th name. Then go get them, she said. It came out flat and simple, which was how she meant it. Reeves looked at her, and something in his face that had been carrying the night's weight shifted slightly. Not amusement, but the closest thing to it she'd seen from him. Yeah, he said. We will. She left him to it. She went back to room 4 because that was where she needed to be, and because the alternative was standing in corridors, thinking about things she could not currently affect, which had never been a productive use of her time. Voss was awake. Not fully, not the coherent tracking wakefulness of a man who'd had a full recovery, but the incremental present wakefulness of someone working back toward themselves. His eyes followed her when she came in. She pulled the bedside stool close and sat at his level rather than standing over him, because she'd learned in a specific dusty concrete floor context that how you positioned your body near someone who'd been through what he'd been through was not a minor thing. You have questions, she said. His lips were dry. She gave him water through a straw, the small ordinary assistance of it, and watched him drink and watched the effort that required, and remembered that he had been 12 days in and was currently running on the thin end of his reserves. The drive, he said, still abraded but clearer than before. Safe. Reeves's team pulled the full content. The recording is intact. She held his gaze. 48 names. Something moved across his face. He told you about the 48th. An hour ago. He was quiet for a moment. The monitor kept its steady commentary. Outside the window, Clearwater was doing what mid-sized Colorado mountain towns did on autumn mornings. The light was clean and the air was probably cold, and somewhere below the hospital's parking lot, there were still black vehicles in positions that had nothing to do with the town's ordinary life. I counted 47 for 11 months, Voss said. The 48th showed up 9 days ago, someone who had been careful enough that the architecture didn't point to them until I found a secondary record they hadn't scrubbed. He paused for breath. The effort of sustained speech was visible. That's what they were trying to get to, not the 47, the 48th. The other names are manageable, from their perspective. Embarrassing, operational exposure, careers ended. His eyes were clear despite his body's exhaustion. The 48th name ends more than careers. She understood what he meant. Not the what. She didn't have the specifics and didn't need them yet, but the shape of it. The difference between crimes that embarrass an institution and crimes that implicate one. It's going to be handled, she said. I know. He looked at her directly. You're the one who kept me here long enough for it to matter. She didn't have a clean response to that. The honest response was complicated. Something about how she'd done what was in front of her because it was in front of her, because the man on the gurney had been dying and she'd known how to stop it, because in her specific experience, the question of whether to act when you can act had stopped being a question a long time ago. But that was too much for a man still working through pharmaceutical sedation. Rest, she said. You did the hard part. He almost smiled. So did you. She left him to sleep and went to write her notes. The morning moved. That was the thing about hospitals. They moved regardless of what had happened inside them, because the structure of need was larger than any single event. Patients arrived and were treated and were stabilized and were discharged. The supply cart with the broken wheel caught on the tile near the nurse's station. The coffee maker in the break room produced its catalog-tasting output. Carla handed off to the next shift. Brian went home and probably slept immediately because he'd earned it. Emily was in the middle of a medication reconciliation for a patient in room 2, a 63-year-old man named Howard who had arrived the previous week with a pulmonary event and was now stable and irritable about the hospital food, which was a sign of recovery. When Reeves appeared in the ICU entrance and made the small gesture that meant he needed a moment, she finished Howard's reconciliation, told him the food would not improve and that she was genuinely sorry about it, and went into the corridor. Reeves was not alone. Beside him was a woman Emily hadn't seen before, late 50s, in civilian clothes that had the same quality as Reeves's civilian clothes, meaning the clothes were civilian and the person wearing them was not. She had gray-streaked hair cut short and the specific posture of someone who had spent decades making decisions in rooms that didn't tolerate hesitation. "This is Deputy Administrator Farrow," Reeves said. "She's been running the oversight investigation." "Your own oversight," Emily said, looking at Farrow. "My own oversight?" Farrow confirmed. Her voice was direct in the way of someone who had given up on softening things by a certain age and found the resulting efficiency worth the occasional bluntness. "We brought the 48th individual in for questioning at 5:30 this morning. They're currently in federal custody in Denver." Emily waited. "The referral to your nursing license review board has been formally intercepted and withdrawn. The liaison who submitted it has been placed on administrative hold pending the subpoena process." Farrow looked at her without the measuring quality Reeves had, more like someone delivering a report to a person entitled to receive it. "You have no pending actions against your license or your employment. The record from yesterday's termination has been corrected at the hospital level and will be corrected at the state licensing level by end of week." "The 48th, Emily said. "The name." Farrow and Reeves exchanged a look that was quick and practiced, the look of two people who have already discussed how much to say. Farrow said, "Someone at the deputy directorate level, not Reeves's chain, a parallel oversight structure that was supposed to provide checks on exactly the kind of operation Voss was investigating." She paused. "The checks were compromised. The person responsible for running them was the one compromising them." "For how long?" "We believe 3 years, possibly 4. Farrow's jaw was tight. "Long enough." Emily looked at the wall of the corridor for a moment. 3 or 4 years of institutional betrayal, built inside the structure that was supposed to prevent it, serviced by a network that ran through hospitals and financial accounts and medical board liaisons and maintenance workers with tactical sole shoes. It was the specific durable darkness of a thing that had been given time to grow, and the question of how it had been given that time, who hadn't looked, who had looked away, who had looked and made a calculation, was one she suspected would take considerably longer than the morning to answer. "What happens now?" she said. Not for herself, for the shape of what came next. Federal prosecution, multiple defendants. The financial records alone provide the evidentiary foundation. We don't even need Voss's testimony, though we'll have it. The recording adds 17 specific conversations that establish intent and coordination at the organizational level. Farrow paused. "It will be public, it will be long, and it will be thorough." She nodded. Public and thorough she could live with. She went back to Howard and his medication reconciliation. 3 days later, Marcus Hale was formally charged. The charging document, which Emily did not go looking for, but which Donna texted her at 7 in the morning with the specific energy of someone who had been waiting to send that text, listed conspiracy to commit murder, medical fraud, obstruction of a federal investigation, receipt of payment to alter medical care, and 4 additional counts related to his involvement in the deaths of 2 prior patients whose cases were now being reviewed. The last 2 counts were the ones that made the document quiet to read and heavy to hold. He had not, in the end, been just arrogant. He had been paid for 22 months to be specifically less good at his job at moments that suited someone else's operational timeline. He had taken money to make people harder to save, and he had done it while wearing the authority of his title and the certainty of his expertise and the dismissal of people who tried to tell him something was wrong, and he had done it in a hospital where people came because they had nowhere else to go. Emily read the charging document twice. Then she put her phone in her pocket and went to check on Voss. He was sitting up, coherent, present, the color of a man who had come a long way from a trauma bay in 48 hours. He had asked for coffee that morning, which Brian had taken as a significant clinical indicator and had reported to Emily with the specific satisfaction of someone who'd had a long night and needed the win. "You're leaving soon," Emily said. It wasn't a question. She could see it in the quality of his attention, the outward orientation of a person whose crisis has passed and whose mind has already begun reassembling itself around what comes next. "Tomorrow," he said. "Transfer." "Good." He looked at her. "Are you staying here?" She thought about it, about Clearwater, about the specific quietness she'd chosen, about the fact that the quietness had turned out to be something else, about Howard in room 2, irritable and recovering, about Brian's thorough logs and Donna's 7 a.m. texts, and Marcia's steady competence, and the broken wheel on the supply cart that still hadn't been fixed. For now, she said. Voss nodded like that meant something specific to him. Reeves is going to want to talk to you about what comes next. I know. You don't have to say yes. I know that too. He looked at her with the clear, direct attention of a man who had been doing difficult things in difficult places for a long time and had developed the specific ability to see people accurately. You've been hiding, he said. Not unkindly. She didn't argue it. I was trying to be somewhere quiet. Did it work? She almost laughed. It surprised her, the nearness of it, the way it moved through her chest before she caught it. Not particularly. No, he said. It usually doesn't. He was quiet for a moment. I retired once, 3 years ago. I lasted 8 months before something landed in front of me that I couldn't walk past. She looked at him. It's not a design flaw, he said. Knowing how to do something and being unable to not do it when it matters. That's not a flaw. She sat with that for a moment. Then she said, Rest. Your transfer team is going to want you ambulatory tomorrow. He settled back against the pillow. Yes, ma'am. She left the room and stood in the corridor and felt the weight of the last 72 hours distributed across her body in the specific total way of weight that has been processed rather than set down, carried differently, not absent. Reeves was waiting at the end of the corridor. He'd been doing that, appearing at the ends of corridors unhurriedly without making a production of it. She walked toward him. He told you I'd want to talk, Reeves said. He did. They went to the small conference room, which his team had partially packed up. The wall of documents reduced, the laptops closed, the room returning incrementally to the scheduling meeting space it had been 2 days ago. He sat down across from her, which again he didn't usually do, and she registered it. The prosecution will run 18 months minimum, probably longer. He laced his hands on the table. Hale, Saul, the liaison, the 48th, and 31 of the 47 identified individuals who have enough evidentiary weight against them for federal charges. The remaining 16 are under investigation. Some will be charged, some will plea, some will cooperate. He paused. Voss's recording is the foundation of all of it. And Voss. Voss will testify. He'll be protected until then and supported through the process. Reeves held her gaze. He's going to be fine. She nodded. Your nursing license referral was formally withdrawn this morning. The board has been notified. Clearwater's state licensing authority has a corrected record as of 9 a.m. He paused. The hospital's formal apology is being documented publicly at Dr. Pask's insistence. She was very clear about that. I know. She told me herself. She's a good administrator. He said it with the candid simplicity of someone paying genuine credit. She deserves a better chief of surgery than she's been working with. Emily looked at the table for a moment. What did you want to talk to me about? He was quiet in the way of someone who has prepared for a conversation and is taking a moment to decide where to start. There's a unit being formed, federal but with civilian medical integration, specifically built for situations where the standard emergency response framework is inadequate. Field-adjacent medical operations, classified environments. The kind of situations where you need someone who can manage a pharmacological assassination attempt in a regional hospital ICU, while simultaneously identifying the asset in the room. He looked at her steadily. Someone designed it. I wasn't involved in the design, but I was consulted. She looked at him. Voss designed it. A slight pause. Voss identified the need based on specific operational gaps he documented over the last 3 years. His recommendation was formalized 6 months ago. Reeves held her gaze. The recommendation included a name for the unit's medical director. She was quiet. Your name, he said. From a man who didn't know you'd be the one saving his life when he wrote it down. He'd identified you from prior service records, from the classified pharmacology work, from a specific incident report filed in your last deployment that... He stopped. That he found persuasive. She thought about her last deployment, about the incident report, about the things she'd done that had gone into a report and the report had gone into a system, and she'd told herself after that it was done, it was filed, it was behind her, and she'd come to Clearwater to be somewhere quiet. "I'm a probationary nurse," she said. "You were," Reeves said. "As of this morning, your nursing staff, full credentials, with a letter of commendation from the administrator of Harlow County General on your record." He let that sit for a moment. "You're also someone with a specific combination of training that took a career to develop and an instinct that doesn't come from training. The unit needs a director who has both." She looked at the table, at her hands on it. The hands that had moved through the trauma bay 3 mornings ago with the automatic authority of something practiced past the point of conscious effort. She turned them over and looked at her palms, which told her nothing new. "I'll need time to think about it," she said. "You have it." He said it without pressure. "The unit doesn't stand up for another 4 months. There's time." She nodded, stood up. "Carter." His voice had the quality she'd started to recognize, the one that meant he was going to say something that mattered without making a production of it. "What you did here, starting in the trauma bay, through the next 36 hours. He paused. "It wasn't just skill. Plenty of skilled people would have walked out when security came, would have let the situation be what it looked like. A personnel conflict, a protocol dispute, something to be managed from a distance." She waited. "You didn't walk out," he said, "and I've been doing this long enough to know that's rarer than it should be." She thought about the corridor, about security's hand on her shoulder, and the word fired and the choice to turn around, about what it had cost her in the moment to turn around. Not much, actually. Less than she'd expected. Less than turning away would have cost. "He was dying," she said. "I knew how to stop it." "That's the whole answer?" She considered. "That's most of it." He almost smiled. This time it made it further toward completion. She walked out of the conference room and down the corridor and took the elevator to the first floor and stepped outside into the morning air, which was cold the way Colorado mountain air is cold in early fall, clean and absolute and not interested in your preferences about it. The parking lot had been returned to a parking lot. The black vehicles were gone. The perimeter positions were gone. There was a maintenance truck near the far entrance and 3 regular cars and a man walking a dog on the sidewalk across the street who was not one of Reeves's people, just a man walking a dog. She stood there for a few minutes. She thought about Voss saying it's not a design flaw, about the specific relief of hearing that from a person who had lived it, not as a comfort, not as reassurance, but as a factual observation from someone who had the data. She'd spent 14 months treating it as a liability. The inability to walk past something she could affect, had come to Clearwater specifically to reduce the likelihood of encountering things she would need to affect, had arranged her life to be small enough that the question of whether to act wouldn't come up very often. And then a man had arrived on a gurney with modified organophosphates in his blood, and the quiet of her life had simply ended. Not because she'd sought it out, because the thing in front of her had required her, and she'd been who she was, and that was that. She'd been fired for it. Formally terminated, walked out by security, her badge revoked on her 3rd day. She'd been called reckless and unauthorized and dangerous. She'd had a formal complaint filed against her through a system that had been corrupted to create exactly that kind of leverage against exactly that kind of person. She'd had, at various points in the last 36 hours, every institutional tool pointed at her that was available to the people who wanted her out. And she was still here. Not in spite of who she was. Because of it. She went back inside. She had patients who needed checking and notes that needed finishing and a 63-year-old man named Howard who was going to complain about the food again, which she was going to listen to without particular sympathy, but with genuine attention, because his complaining meant he was here and recovering and planning to go home and make his own food, which was the point. 3 weeks later, Dr. Marcus Hale stood before a federal magistrate in Denver and entered a plea. The courtroom was not packed. Federal proceedings rarely are, and this one was early on a Tuesday morning, but it was attended, and the attending included 2 people from the medical board, a journalist from the state's largest paper, and a woman from the Attorney General's office who had been building the supplementary state charges for 9 days. Hale entered a plea of not guilty to all counts, which was what his attorneys had advised and which the federal prosecutor had expected. The magistrate set the trial date for 7 months out. The conditions of his release were reviewed and rejected, and he was remanded. He was walked out of the courtroom in the specific, unremarkable way of an institutional process that does not require drama because the weight of it is already sufficient. Emily was not there. She knew about it because Donna texted her, "Hail remanded," with a punctuation choice that communicated significant satisfaction, and because the Attorney General's office had called her the previous week to confirm her availability as a potential witness, which she'd confirmed. She did not need to be in the courtroom to understand what it meant. She was at Harlow County General in Bay 3, where the overhead lights had finally been repaired. A maintenance worker, a different one, a regular one, a man named Pete, who had been doing the hospital's electrical repairs for 9 years and who wore the right shoes, had fixed them the previous Tuesday. The light was even and clean, and she had noticed it every day since. She was mid-shift when her phone rang. Not a text, a call, which was unusual from that number. Reeves. She stepped into the corridor. "What?" "The 48th is entering a cooperation agreement," he said. "In exchange for testimony against the 12 most senior remaining defendants, they've agreed to full disclosure and a signed statement." A pause. "The statement implicates 3 additional individuals not on Voss's original recording. One of them is significant." "How significant?" "Significant enough that the Attorney General is being briefed this afternoon." He paused. "I wanted you to know before it becomes public." She leaned against the corridor wall. "Is Voss's case intact?" "Completely. The cooperation agreement actually strengthens it. It provides corroborating testimony for the 8 counts that relied most heavily on the recording." Reeves's voice was even. "He's going to testify in 8 weeks. The recording goes into evidence. It's done, Carter. The building is coming down." She stood in the corridor of Harlow County General with the clean light from the repaired bay, 3 fixtures touching the edge of the corridor, and she thought about 47 names, and then 48, and then the 3 additional ones. And she thought about the architecture of a thing built to avoid accountability, and how it had come down not through any single dramatic action, but through the accumulation of things that hadn't gone according to plan. A nurse who'd noticed the wrong mark on a wrist, a treatment that had interrupted a timeline, a patient who'd survived long enough for his recording to reach the right hands, the accumulation of one person refusing to leave a room. "Good," she said. "The unit," Reeves said. 4 months becomes 3. The timeline moved up. He paused. "I need an answer." She looked at the Bay 3 entrance, at the clean, even light, at Donna moving past the nurse's station with a chart, pausing to look at her through the glass with the specific expression of a woman who had learned to read the quality of Emily's phone calls. "I need 2 more weeks," Emily said. "You have them." She hung up, looked at Donna through the glass. Donna raised her eyebrows, the universal nursing staff gesture for well. Emily shook her head slightly, later, and went back to her patients. 2 weeks later, she gave Reeves her answer on a Wednesday morning in the small conference room that had been returned entirely to a scheduling meeting space, with its regular chairs and its whiteboard and its complete absence of printed documents on the walls. She told him yes. She also told him she would finish the month at Harlow County General first, which he accepted without argument, which she'd expected because she'd worked out by then that Reeves's lack of argument was usually a form of respect. She told Howard she was leaving. He was being discharged that day. His pulmonary event had resolved cleanly, and his irritability had achieved a pitch that indicated full recovery. And they had the conversation in his room while he was putting on the shirt his wife had brought, struggling slightly with the buttons because his left shoulder was still stiff. "You're moving on," he said. "I am." "You've been here, what, a month?" "About that." He looked at her. He was a man who had worked with his hands for 40 years and had the specific directness of someone who hadn't learned to soften things in professional settings because he'd never worked in professional settings. "You're good at this," he said. "Better than most of them." "Thank you, Howard." "The food is still terrible." "I know. I'm sorry." He got the last button, looked at her with the uncomplicated warmth of a man who had been cared for and was expressing it the only way he knew how, which was gruffly and briefly. "Take care of yourself," he said. She helped him into the wheelchair for the discharge process. Watched his wife arrive at the entrance, watched Howard stand up from the wheelchair with the specific minor triumph of a man who has been horizontal for 2 weeks and is upright again. Watched them walk out through the automatic doors into the cold Colorado morning. She went back to her notes. On her last day, Donna organized something in the break room. Not a party. Nothing with streamers or a sheet cake, which Emily would have found difficult. Just the day shift, gathered in the break room during the overlap window when the coffee was at peak availability, and there were enough of them to make it feel like something. Brian was there, looking like he'd slept recently, and was pleased about it. Marsh came up from toxicology and stood near the door with her arms crossed and nodded at Emily in the specific way of mutual professional acknowledgement between two people who have been through something and don't need to perform the emotions about it. Donna gave a speech. It was short, which was right, and honest, which was better. She said Emily Carter had walked into this hospital on her 3rd day of nursing work and done something that most experienced physicians wouldn't have attempted. Not because she was reckless, but because she was paying attention when it mattered. She said the hospital was better for having had her, and that she hoped whatever she was going to next knew what it was getting. Emily said thank you, and meant it without qualification, and did not make a speech because the situation didn't require one. She cleaned out her locker. There wasn't much to clean: a spare set of scrubs, a water bottle, a book she'd been reading in the call room on slow nights. She put her badge on the counter at the nurse's station because it was a hospital badge, and it belonged to the hospital. She drove out of the hospital parking lot on a Thursday afternoon with the mountains visible to the west in the clear fall light, the kind of light that makes the peaks look closer than they are and more defined and real than anything constructed. And she thought about a forward operating base and a concrete floor, and a man whose pupils had been wrong, and what had happened to him in the 40 minutes before anyone believed her. She thought about what it had cost her to carry that, about the weight of a thing you did right that nobody recognized as right, and how long you could carry it before it became something that changed how you moved through the world. She thought about a trauma bay, and a gurney, and a mark on a wrist that everyone had missed. She thought about turning around. There were people who spent their whole lives becoming exactly who they are, building the competence, absorbing the cost, carrying the weight, and then spending an equal amount of time apologizing for it. Hiding it, shrinking it to a size that fit inside whatever room they'd been assigned. She had done that. She'd come to Clearwater to do that, to be a quiet nurse in a regional hospital where the biggest emergencies were ski accidents, to be smaller than she was, because being her full size had hurt before, and small things don't get fired, and small things don't get noticed, and small things don't get dragged out of rooms by security in front of people who've already decided you're nothing. But small things also don't turn around. Small things let the man on the gurney go to CT. Small things wait to be recognized before they act. Small things calculate the cost of the action against the cost to themselves, and when the numbers don't add up for them personally, they walk away. And the man on the gurney dies in the imaging machine, and it looks like trauma, not murder, and nobody is the wiser. She had not been small. She had been exactly who she was, in the place where being exactly who she was had mattered. And the man on the gurney was alive, and the building was coming down, and a recording with 48 names was sitting in a federal evidence file on its way to a trial that would run for months and would be thorough. That was not an accident. That was not luck. That was the accumulated weight of every hard thing she'd done in every hard place she'd done it, arriving all at once in a trauma bay in a mid-sized hospital in a mountain town, demanding to be used. She drove west. The mountains stayed visible. The light stayed clean. Whatever room she walked into next, she intended to take up her full amount of space, not because she was certain it would be recognized, not because the recognition was the point, but because the man on the floor of that forward operating base, and the man on the gurney in Bay 1, and every person who would end up on a gurney in whatever came next, deserved someone in the room who was paying full attention and was not too small to act on it. That was the whole answer. She drove until Clearwater was behind her, and the road opened up, and the sky was the specific enormous blue of high altitude in autumn, the kind of blue that has no ceiling, and she let herself, for the first time in 14 months, feel entirely like who she was. It turned out that wasn't a liability at all.